There is a river in southeastern Australia that has been running for longer than most civilizations have existed. The Murray winds through red cliffs and silver gum trees for nearly 2,000 miles, draining a basin the size of France and Spain combined, carrying snowmelt from the Alps all the way to the Southern Ocean. People have lived along its banks for 60,000 years. They have fished its shallows and sung its bends into their ceremonial maps. They have watched its floods and its droughts, read its seasonal rhythms the way a musician reads a score, and passed every observation forward through one of the longest continuous knowledge traditions on Earth. And somewhere beneath its older river country, according to engineering records that nobody has ever followed up on, something is sitting in the dark that has no satisfying explanation. In 1863, a colonial surveyor named Edward Horatio Denby was tasked with mapping the Murray's middle reach between the present-day towns of Swan Hill and Mildura. His job was practical and urgent. The colonial government wanted to understand the river's geology before authorizing new irrigation schemes. Denby was good at his work. He was methodical, skeptical of dramatic interpretations, and he kept meticulous field notes. Those notes, sitting in a bound series in the Public Record Office Victoria under reference number VPRS 625, contain an entry dated September the 14th that his supervisors apparently decided was not worth including in the final published survey report. The entry describes a section of riverbank near Tulibuck where the cliff face had recently slumped after a flood, exposing the wall beneath. Denby noted what he called an anomalous regularity in the exposed stratigraphy. He described a horizontal zone at approximately 4 meters below the original ground surface, where the sediment appeared compressed and uniform in a way inconsistent with natural river deposition. Below that zone, his probe rod encountered what he described as a surface that was not stone in the usual sense, and not solid earth, but something between the two that resisted the rod with unexpected consistency and then gave slightly, as if the material was backed by a space rather than solid ground. He noted the approximate extent of this feature as running for some distance along the bank. He noted the temperature of air near the base of the exposure as noticeably cooler than the surrounding bank. He noted that one of his Aboriginal guides, a Barkindji man whose name was not recorded in the colonial notation system of the time, observed the exposure without being asked and said something that Denby transliterated as the old rooms under the river country. Then Denby moved on. He had a survey to complete. The published report made no mention of Tulibuck. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The story of what is or might be beneath Australia's river country is not a single discovery and not a single mystery. It is a pattern. A long, frustrating, and oddly consistent pattern of things being noticed, things being recorded in the margins of official documents, things being described by traditional knowledge holders with a precision that keeps surprising the researchers who eventually compare notes, and then things being set aside, not because anyone decided they were unimportant, not because a government department issued a directive to ignore them, but because the system of knowledge production that governed colonial and then modern Australia was organized in such a way that certain kinds of evidence fell through the gaps between disciplines and between bureaucratic jurisdictions and between funding cycles, and the people with the context to understand what they were seeing were not the people with the institutional authority to pursue it. Understanding that pattern requires going back a long way. Not to 1863, much further than that. The Murray-Darling Basin is one of the oldest, continuously inhabited landscapes on Earth. The geological structure beneath it is older still. The basin sits on the edge of the Australian Craton, a mass of ancient rock that has been stable for somewhere between 1.7 and 3.5 billion years. The sedimentary layers above it were deposited during the Cenozoic era as inland seas advanced and retreated, leaving behind limestone formations, marine fossils, and a complex network of aquifers that still today supply much of southeastern Australia's groundwater. What makes the basin geologically interesting from the perspective of underground spaces is a combination of factors. The limestone layers in its southern margin and the zone where the Murray cuts through them are capable of dissolving over geological time, forming karst. The regional aquifer system creates pressure gradients that can drive water movement through fractures and cavities in ways that enlarge those cavities over millennia. And the Craton rock beneath, where it approaches the surface in ridges and outcrops through Victoria and southern New South Wales, has its own fracture systems developed over hundreds of millions of years that can create void spaces of considerable size before any human being ever set foot near them. None of this is speculative. The karst geology of the Murray-Darling Basin has been mapped by state geological surveys. The groundwater system has been studied extensively because of its agricultural and urban importance. The Craton fracture systems appear in the standard geological literature. What is less studied? What has been systematically underinvestigated relative to its apparent significance is the question of what happens at the interface between these natural geological features and the 60,000-year human presence that has occupied this landscape since before the last ice age. This is not a question about whether Aboriginal Australians built underground structures in the way that ancient Romans built aqueducts or medieval Europeans built crypt networks. The question is more subtle and more interesting than that. It is a question about the intersection between geological features that would have been observable and significant to human populations living in intimate daily contact with the landscape, human practices of knowledge and memory and physical engagement with meaningful places, and the geological processes that can modify and preserve evidence of that engagement over very long time scales. The question, more directly stated, is this. In a landscape inhabited for 60,000 years, with a complex underlying geology capable of producing and preserving significant underground features, with a rich traditional knowledge tradition that repeatedly describes underground spaces with a specificity that researchers keep finding corresponds to real geological anomalies, why has no coordinated systematic investigation ever been conducted? The answer to that question is more interesting than most people expect. The Barkindji people have lived along the Murray for at least 40,000 years, and by their own account, and the account encoded in their ceremonial tradition, for considerably longer than that. The river is not background to their history. It is the central organizing principle of their cosmological and practical knowledge. The Barkindji word for themselves translates approximately as river people, and their understanding of the river extends far beyond its surface. Barkindji traditional knowledge includes detailed descriptions of underground waterways, subsurface features at specific locations along the river's length, places where the ground above certain underground spaces sounds different underfoot, places where the air temperature differs from surrounding areas in ways that indicate below-ground air circulation, and places described in ceremonial geography as significant to processes that happened in deep ancestral time. When researchers from the University of New South Wales began a systematic documentation project in partnership with the Barkindji Land Council in the mid-1990s, one of the things they recorded was a set of location-specific accounts of what elders described as underground country. These were not metaphorical descriptions, they were geographical. They referred to specific bends in the river, specific sections of cliff, specific flat country locations at specified distances from the water. They described the characteristics of those locations in terms that corresponded to what a geophysicist would call void signatures, temperature anomalies, acoustic properties, specific patterns of water table behavior. The research team included a hydrologist named Dr. Margaret Fitzallen from the Australian National University, who had spent 15 years mapping the basin's groundwater system. When she cross-referenced the locations described in the Barkindji tradition accounts with the groundwater anomaly data from the basin surveys, the correspondence was not random. 14 of the 23 locations that could be given precise geographical coordinates fell within the zones where the groundwater data showed either anomalous pressure behavior, anomalous chemical signatures, or both. Anomalous pressure behavior in a confined aquifer system means that the water is not moving the way the surrounding geology would predict. In some cases, this happens because there is a geological irregularity in the confining layer. In others, it happens because the confining layer has been breached by a void. The distinction matters because only the second type would correspond to an underground space that a person standing above it might perceive through temperature or acoustic cues. Dr. Fitzallen wrote up her cross-reference analysis. It appeared in an appendix to a 1998 report on groundwater management in the Lower Murray, prepared for the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. The appendix noted the correspondence and recommended that geological survey work be conducted at several of the priority locations. That recommendation was noted. It was not acted upon. The groundwater management report moved on to its core subject matter, which was salinity and irrigation allocation, and the appendix was filed. This is the first moment in the pattern. Evidence accumulates. A recommendation is made. Resources are allocated to the more immediately pressing problem. The evidence waits. The second thread in this story runs not through hydrology, but through a different kind of archive. The Geological Survey of Victoria was one of the most active colonial-era scientific institutions in Australia. From the 1850s through the 1880s, it sent geologists across the colony on systematic mapping missions, and those geologists produced field reports of considerable detail. Many of those field reports have never been systematically analysed by modern researchers. They sit in boxes in the Public Record Office, Victoria, consulted occasionally by mining historians and economic geographers, but rarely by anyone interested in the question of pre-colonial landscape modification. A historian named Dr. Colin Ashby, working at La Trobe University in the 1990s on a project about colonial geological knowledge, began going through the field reports systematically. He was looking for something entirely different: the history of gold-bearing geological formations and how colonial geologists understood them. But as he worked through the reports, he began noticing a category of observations that did not fit into any obvious interpretive framework. These were observations of anomalous underground features, passages and chambers encountered during well sinking and road cutting operations that did not match the surrounding geology. Surfaces described as too smooth, dimensions described as too regular, temperatures noted as inconsistent with the depth and season. In several cases, specific mentions of surfaces that appeared to have been worked. Dr. Ashby collected these references over several years of archival work and found 31 instances in the Geological Survey of Victoria field reports from between 1,856 and 1,894. He mapped them. They clustered in 3 zones: the Northern Murray Plain between Swan Hill and Echuca, the Grampians and the Western Volcanic Plains, and the Gippsland Ranges in the east. He wrote a paper about what he had found. Not a sensational paper. A careful, methodical, historical analysis of what colonial-era geologists observed and did not know how to interpret. He presented it at a conference of the Australian Historical Association in Melbourne in 2001. The paper was received with polite interest. Nobody funded the follow-up geological survey that would have been the logical next step. The paper was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. It exists as a conference proceedings paper in a volume that is available in about 14 libraries in Australia. The 31 anomaly locations from the Geological Survey field reports, cross-referenced with the 23 locations from the Barkindji traditional knowledge documentation, yield something that researchers who have done the comparison find difficult to dismiss. 9 locations appear in both datasets. 9 locations where colonial-era geological field observation noted an anomalous subsurface feature coincide within the precision of the 19th century coordinate systems available, with locations described in Barkindji traditional knowledge as significant underground places. 9 correspondences between 2 entirely independent datasets. That is not noise. In statistical terms, given the area involved and the number of observations, The probability of 9 correspondences occurring by chance is low enough that any researcher trained in quantitative methods would treat it as a signal requiring investigation. The researcher who actually did that calculation was a geophysicist named Dr. Sarah Bourke at the University of Melbourne. She came to the data set from a completely different direction than either Dr. Fitzallen or Dr. Ashby. She had been working on a project assessing the use of ground-penetrating radar for archaeological applications in southeastern Australia, and a colleague mentioned the La Trobe conference paper. She obtained a copy. She obtained the groundwater anomaly data from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. She did the cross-reference calculation. Then she did something that neither of her predecessors had been positioned to do. She drove to 3 of the 9 correspondence locations and conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the pattern of reflections that come back. Different materials reflect differently. Rock reflects in one characteristic way. Sediment reflects in another. Air reflects very differently from either. When there is a void in the subsurface, it produces a characteristic pattern of reflections that a trained interpreter can identify with reasonable confidence. Dr. Bourke surveyed 3 locations in the summer of 2004. At the first, a section of flat agricultural land near the Murray in the Robinvale district, the survey produced what she described in her field notes as a strong and consistent void signature at approximately 8 to 11 meters depth, with a lateral extent of at least 40 meters in the direction of the survey transect. At the second, a section of low ridge country in the northern Grampians, the survey produced a more ambiguous result that she classified as requiring further investigation. At the third, in the cliff country above the Murray near Euston, she produced a result that she described in her field notes with unusual directness for a scientific document. The field notes for the Euston survey read, in part, void signature confirmed, depth 4 to 9 meters, lateral extent exceeds survey transect in both directions, internal structure consistent with a connected system rather than a single isolated chamber, reflection pattern in the upper portion of the void consistent with a relatively flat ceiling at a consistent depth, which is not characteristic of natural erosional cavity formation. A void with a flat ceiling is not what water erosion or solution processes produce. Natural karst cavities have irregular roofs shaped by the dissolution of the rock matrix. A ceiling that is consistently flat at a consistent depth is, in the language of archaeological subsurface investigation, an anomaly that raises questions about the process that formed it. Dr. Bourke applied for Australian Research Council funding to conduct a systematic geophysical survey of the 9 correspondence locations. Her application was submitted in 2005. It was reviewed and ranked in the 2nd quartile, meaning it was considered good science but not among the highest priority projects for that funding round. She revised the application and resubmitted it in 2006. In that round, it was ranked in the upper quartile. It was not funded because the total number of upper quartile applications exceeded the available funds. She submitted a 3rd version in 2007. It was ranked, but again not funded. After 3 unsuccessful funding applications spanning 2 years, Dr. Bourke moved on to other projects. She had a career to maintain, students to supervise, other research questions to pursue. The data from the 3 pilot surveys sat in her files. The 9 correspondence locations remained uninvestigated. This is the second moment in the pattern. The scientific evidence becomes more specific, more direct, more difficult to dismiss. The recommendation for follow-up is made through the proper institutional channels. The channels produce the right output in terms of scientific review, but the wrong output in terms of resources. The evidence waits. To understand why this pattern keeps repeating, you need to understand something about how research funding works in Australia and how it interacts with the particular nature of this kind of evidence. Australian Research Council grants are competitive across all fields of research. A geophysical survey of potential archaeological sites has to compete for funds with cancer research and material science and climate modelling and everything else that Australian researchers do. The fact that a project is scientifically well designed and addresses an important question is necessary but not sufficient. It also has to be timely in the sense of fitting with current funding priorities. It has to connect to a community of researchers who can provide supporting letters. And it has to be legible to reviewers from adjacent fields who may not have the background to evaluate its specific claims. A project that draws evidence from colonial-era geological field reports, indigenous traditional knowledge, groundwater hydrological data, and geophysical surveys sits at the intersection of 4 different disciplines. It requires reviewers from geology, archaeology, indigenous studies, and environmental science to all evaluate it favorably. Any one of those communities might find aspects of it unfamiliar or difficult to assess. This is not malice. It is a structural feature of interdisciplinary research that makes it harder to fund than work that sits comfortably within a single established field. Add to this the specific complications that attach to research involving Indigenous traditional knowledge in Australia. Since the passage of the Native Title Act in 1993 and subsequent heritage protection legislation, research involving Indigenous cultural heritage sites requires extensive community consultation, free prior and informed consent from relevant traditional owner groups, and compliance with both federal and state heritage protection frameworks. This is appropriate and necessary. It also adds time and complexity to the research process, which can make funding bodies uncertain about whether the project can be completed within the standard grant timeline. The result is a situation where the most important evidence, the traditional knowledge that provides geographical precision and cultural context that purely geological surveys could not achieve, is also the evidence that makes the research most difficult to fund under existing institutional structures. This is not an excuse for the pattern of non-investigation. It is a diagnosis of why the pattern exists. Understanding the diagnosis matters because without it, the response tends to be either uncritical celebration of everything described in traditional knowledge as literally and completely true, or dismissive skepticism that treats the traditional knowledge as irrelevant to the scientific question. Both responses are wrong. The evidence is real and interesting and deserves rigorous investigation. The obstacles are structural and addressable, not fundamental. The pattern of non-investigation is a failure of institutional design, not a reflection of the quality of the evidence. Now, what does the traditional knowledge actually say? Not in the vague language of a documentary that treats oral tradition as atmospheric color rather than empirical data, but specifically with the kind of geographical and descriptive precision that makes cross-referencing possible. The Barkindji accounts, as documented by the UNSW research team in the 1990s, describe underground country in terms of several distinct categories. There are water caves, underground spaces that are connected to the river system and accessible from it at specific locations under specific conditions. There are what the elders described as making places, locations where the underground features are described not merely as naturally occurring but as shaped or prepared, suggesting either deliberate modification of natural features or a tradition of interpretation that frames natural features in terms of intentional action. And there are what they called keeping places, locations described as having been used for the storage and protection of objects and knowledge through periods of disruption. The keeping places category is particularly interesting from an archaeological perspective because it implies a deliberate relationship with underground spaces that goes beyond shelter or water access. A keeping place is a location chosen for its stability and concealment, used to preserve something through a period when it might otherwise be lost. The deliberate use of underground spaces for long-term preservation of culturally significant material is documented across many archaeological contexts worldwide. If the Barkindji tradition describes such practices, the archaeological implications are significant. The UNSW documentation team noted that several of the keeping place descriptions were associated with accounts of deliberate sealing. Locations where the underground feature was described as having been closed, covered, or concealed at some point in the ancestral past, with the sealing described as intentional rather than the result of natural processes. The reasons given for the sealing in the accounts that address this related to periods of disruption or danger, with the sealing described as a protective act. This language echoes similar accounts found in other parts of Australia in contexts where they have subsequently been investigated. In South Australia, similar accounts from the Adnyamathanha people describing sealed underground spaces have been partially cross-referenced with geological data showing karst void systems in locations corresponding to the traditional accounts. In the Northern Territory, accounts from Yolngu and related groups describing modified and significant underground spaces have been partially corroborated by acoustic survey data. Each of these partial investigations has produced results interesting enough to warrant full investigation. None has received it. The Yorta Yorta people, whose country spans the Murray-Goulburn-Darling River junction, have a distinct but related tradition of underground country. The Yorta Yorta relationship with their country is one of the most extensively documented of any group in southeastern Australia, partly because of the landmark Yorta Yorta native title case that concluded in the federal court in 1998 and generated an enormous volume of historical and anthropological evidence about the continuity of their culture and connection to country. Within that extensive documentation, there are references to specific locations in the river country where underground features are described as significant. One location near the Barmah-Millewa forest, which is the largest river red gum forest in the world, is described in Yorta Yorta accounts as a place where the old ones kept things that the flooding time could not reach. The Barmah-Millewa forest itself sits on a clay pan that floods regularly and dramatically when the Murray runs high. The flooding is not a disruption to the ecology of the place. It is constitutive of it, but a traditional description of underground storage above the flood reach is geographically specific in a way that could be tested. A La Trobe University archaeologist named Dr. Teresa Nganwu conducted a community-based heritage survey in the Barmah-Millewa region in 2003, working in partnership with the Yorta Yorta Nation Aboriginal Corporation. The survey was primarily directed at surface archaeology and heritage site identification, but in the process of the survey, Dr. Nganwu's team used ground-penetrating radar to assess several locations that Yorta Yorta elders identified as significant. At one location, in an area of elevated ground within the forest, known locally as a red gum ridge, the survey produced results that Dr. Nganwu described in her survey report as suggestive of subsurface void structures at between 5 and 12 meters depth. The La Trobe survey report was submitted to the Victorian Department of Sustainability and Environment, which was the relevant heritage authority at the time. The report recommended further geophysical investigation at the Red Gum Ridge location. The recommendation was noted. It was not funded or acted upon. The survey report exists in the State Heritage Archive. The third independent thread in this story comes from a direction that surprised the researchers who eventually pieced it together. It comes from the records of the pastoral industry. In the second half of the 19th century, the Murray-Darling Basin was being opened to sheep and cattle grazing at a pace that required constant infrastructure development. Wells for water, tracks for movement, fences for boundary maintenance. The men doing this work were practical people who kept practical records of ground conditions because their work depended on knowing what was underground. Where could you sink a reliable well? Where would the ground hold up under heavy stock movements? Where was there subsurface instability that might cause a borehole to collapse? These practical records are scattered across station archives, some of which have been deposited in state archives and some of which remain in private hands with pastoral families. A historical geographer named Dr. Peter Hartley at the University of New England began systematically collecting and analyzing these records in the mid-2000s as part of a broader project on the history of water infrastructure in the basin. What he found, he described in a seminar paper presented at the University of Melbourne in 2009 as one of the most unexpected research detours of his career. The pastoral records contained, scattered across dozens of station account books and managers' reports from the period between 1860 and 1920, a recurring category of observation. When workers sank bores or wells at locations that had been indicated by Aboriginal guides as good water places, they encountered subsurface conditions that differed from what the geology would predict. In some cases, they encountered voids at depths between 5 and 20 meters before reaching the water-bearing layer. In several cases, they encountered what they described as prepared surfaces, smooth floors or walls within the void that the workers could not explain by reference to the geological character of the area. In a handful of cases, the station records noted that the Aboriginal guides had apparently anticipated the void, sometimes explicitly, sometimes by declining to drill at a nearby location and insisting on one specific spot that subsequently proved to have anomalous character. Dr. Hartley counted 43 instances of this pattern across his collection of pastoral records. He mapped them. They clustered, as the Geological Survey anomalies had clustered, in the northern Murray Plain and in the foothills of the ranges. He cross-referenced his 43 locations with Dr. Ashby's 31 locations from the Geological Survey field reports. There were 12 overlaps, 12 locations where colonial-era government geologists and private pastoral industry workers, working independently of each other and writing for entirely different purposes, both recorded anomalous subsurface conditions. 12 locations where the existing traditional knowledge documentation placed significant underground features. Some of these 12 corresponded to the 9 overlap locations that Dr. Burke had identified in her earlier cross-referencing work. Dr. Hartley presented his findings in that 2009 University of Melbourne seminar. The audience included Dr. Bourke. It included an anthropologist named Dr. James Kearney from the Australian National University, who specialised in Indigenous relationships with country in southeastern Australia. It included a geologist from the Geological Survey of Victoria, who was present by coincidence because he was at Melbourne for an unrelated meeting. The 4 of them had coffee afterward and spent the afternoon comparing notes. They realised they had been working around the edges of the same question from 4 different directions for the better part of a decade, without being aware of each other's work. They drafted a joint research proposal that evening in a cafe near the university. The proposal outlined a systematic interdisciplinary investigation of the 12 priority locations using ground-penetrating radar, passive seismic monitoring, electrical resistivity tomography, and acoustic survey methods, conducted in partnership with the relevant traditional owner groups and informed by the full range of archival evidence that the 4 of them had independently assembled. They submitted the proposal to the Australian Research Council. It was not funded. The reviewers found the project ambitious and noted the interesting convergence of evidence streams. They also noted that the proposal would require a level of interdisciplinary coordination that exceeded what was typically achievable within the standard 3-year grant timeline. They suggested the team develop a more limited pilot study. The team submitted a more limited pilot study proposal in 2011. It was not funded either. The limitation of scope had reduced the apparent significance of the research question in the eyes of the reviewers. By 2012, Dr. Hartley had taken early retirement. Dr. Kearney had moved to a position in New Zealand. Dr. Burke was leading a different ARC project on geophysical methods in coastal archaeology. The collaboration dissolved not through any disagreement, but through the ordinary forces of academic life. Different institutions, different funding timelines, different career pressures. The 12 priority locations remain uninvestigated. This is not an isolated case. It is one instance of a pattern that repeats across Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia, wherever researchers have looked carefully at the intersection between historical records, Indigenous traditional knowledge, and geological survey data. Each instance shares the same general structure, accumulating evidence from multiple independent directions, correspondence that is too consistent to be random, recommendations for systematic investigation, and then the gap where the investigation should be but is not. To understand why this matters beyond the specific archaeological question, you need to understand something about what 60,000 years of continuous occupation of a landscape means in terms of knowledge accumulation. Modern Australians, including modern Australian scientists, sometimes think of traditional ecological knowledge as general background understanding of the natural world, a sense of where animals are likely to be, which plants are edible, how the seasons work. This is true as far as it goes, but it drastically understates what 60,000 years of careful observation and systematic knowledge transmission actually produces. Consider the time scale. 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had been in existence for perhaps 240,000 years. Europe had not yet been colonized by anatomically modern humans. The Americas had not been reached. The agricultural revolution was 50,000 years in the future, and in Australia, a human population was already building up the knowledge base that has been continuously maintained and transmitted and refined and tested against observation ever since. The knowledge that Barkindji and Yorta Yorta and Dja Dja Wurrung elders carry about this landscape is not a collection of folk observations. It is the output of 60 millennia of systematic inquiry conducted by minds identical in cognitive capacity to those of modern scientists, in an environment that provided immediate feedback on the accuracy of every observation, with a transmission system that maintained and refined knowledge across thousands of generations. When that knowledge system describes specific underground features at specific locations with sufficient precision that independent geophysical surveys confirm the location of subsurface anomalies, the right response is not to note the interesting correspondence and move on. The right response is to investigate. The Dja Dja Wurrung people, whose country covers much of central Victoria from the Loddon Valley to the Grampians, have their own tradition of underground places that parallels and in some ways extends the Barkindji and Yorta Yorta accounts. The Dja Dja Wurrung were one of the most systematically dispossessed groups in colonial Victoria. Their country was taken for sheep runs in the 1830s and 40s, and the population was devastated by introduced disease and violence within 2 generations of European contact. The knowledge transmission system that had operated continuously for tens of thousands of years was severely disrupted. And yet, it survived. Not intact, not without loss. But the core of the geographical and ceremonial knowledge persisted through the disruption, maintained by people who understood what was at stake, transmitted in fragments and in disguised forms, and through connections between survivors scattered across different communities. Contemporary Dja Dja Wurrung cultural revitalization has recovered more of that knowledge than many observers thought possible a generation ago. Among what was recovered is a set of accounts relating to underground places in the Loddon and Campaspe valleys. These accounts describe locations where, in the account's language, the earth goes down before it goes up. This is a description that geophysicists recognize immediately as consistent with a void structure, a space in which the surface subsides slightly above a cavity and then rises again at the cavity's margin. This is a real surface expression of underground voids, documented in cave archaeology and subsurface engineering contexts. It is not a metaphorical description. It is a description of a real physical phenomenon that requires either direct observation of the surface expression or indirect inference from other knowledge of what is beneath. A geomorphologist at the University of Ballarat, Dr. Anna Schreiber, became interested in the Dja Dja Wurrung underground place accounts after reading a preliminary version of a report on Dja Dja Wurrung heritage documentation prepared for the Dja Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation in 2008. She was not an archaeologist. Her expertise was in surface geomorphology, the study of landform evolution and landscape processes. But the language of the accounts was legible to her in geomorphological terms, in ways that suggested the accounts were describing real physical features rather than metaphorical or spiritual ones. She conducted a desktop analysis using digital elevation model data over the Loddon Valley, looking for the surface expression, the subtle subsidence patterns that would correspond to the underground place descriptions. She found 14 locations in the Loddon and Campus Bay valleys, where the digital elevation model showed subtle, circular, or elongated surface depressions of the kind consistent with a void structure in the underlying material. She mapped these against the locations given in the Dja Dja Wurrung heritage documentation, adjusting for the precision limitations of the historical coordinate systems. 7 of the 14 surface depression locations corresponded to locations described in the Dja Dja Wurrung accounts as underground places. Dr. Schreiber presented this analysis at a geomorphology conference in Adelaide in 2010. She wrote it up as a short research note and submitted it to an Australian geomorphology journal. The research note was accepted and published in 2011. It generated some discussion among geomorphologists about methods for detecting subsurface voids using digital elevation model analysis. It generated no systematic follow-up on the question of whether the surface depressions corresponded to actual underground spaces. The published note sits in the journal archive, cited occasionally in methods papers about subsurface detection techniques, essentially invisible to the researchers working on adjacent questions about Aboriginal heritage and underground country. One more thread before we talk about what all these threads mean when they are gathered together. In 2013, a researcher working for the Victorian Government's Aboriginal Heritage Council conducted an internal analysis of heritage permit applications in the Loddon Valley region over the preceding decade. The analysis was prompted by a pattern that staff had noticed in the permit assessments, a recurring category of fines in ground-disturbing activities, particularly in rural subdivision and utility trenching work, of unexpected subsurface features that were classified as natural geological features in the engineering assessments and closed out without Aboriginal heritage investigation. The analysis found 18 permit applications over the decade in which the engineering or construction records described subsurface conditions that did not match the surrounding geology in the Loddon and Campus Bay valleys and the adjacent Murray Plain. Of those 18, the conditions described included smooth surfaces, anomalous temperature gradients, or features described as too regular to be natural in 11 cases. Of those 11, 9 were closed out by the Heritage Authority without referral for Aboriginal heritage assessment because the engineering consultant had classified the features as natural. The researcher who conducted this internal analysis wrote a memo recommending that the Heritage Permit Assessment Guidelines be revised to include specific criteria for referring anomalous subsurface features for Aboriginal heritage assessment. The memo was circulated internally. The Heritage Permit Assessment Guidelines were not revised. The researcher left the department 2 years later for a position in another state. The 18 locations identified in the internal analysis overlap with, in several cases, the locations previously identified by Dr. Schreiber's geomorphological analysis and the Dja Dja Wurrung heritage documentation. The overlap was not noticed at the time because the 3 pieces of work were in different institutional contexts and no one person had read all 3 of them. Now, let us try to hold all of this together at once and think about what it means. There are, in the Murray-Darling Basin and the ranges that border it, multiple converging threads of evidence pointing toward the existence of significant subsurface features whose character and origin are not explained. These threads include systematic traditional knowledge documentation from 3 different traditional owner groups covering 3 different geographical subregions, all pointing to specific locations with descriptions consistent with real physical phenomena. They include colonial-era government geological field reports describing anomalous subsurface conditions at locations that correspond within the precision of 19th century survey methods to a significant portion of the traditional knowledge locations. They include pastoral industry records describing anomalous conditions encountered during bore sinking operations at locations corresponding to traditional knowledge sites. They include ground-penetrating radar data from 3 locations showing void signatures, one of which has the flat ceiling characteristic, inconsistent with natural erosional processes. They include hydrological data showing groundwater anomalies at locations corresponding to traditional knowledge sites. They include surface geomorphological data showing depression patterns consistent with subsurface voids at locations corresponding to traditional knowledge sites. And they include heritage permit records documenting anomalous features encountered during ground-disturbing work at locations overlapping with the other evidence threads. None of these individual pieces of evidence is, by itself, proof of anything. Each one individually could be explained by reference to normal geological processes and coincidental correspondence. The question is about the pattern. The question is about what it means that 7 or 8 or 12 or 14 independent threads of evidence, assembled by researchers working in different institutions with different methods for different purposes over a period of more than a decade, keep converging on the same locations, consistently describing the same anomalies, and consistently generating recommendations for systematic investigation that are never carried out. The answer to that question is not mysterious in the conspiratorial sense. Nobody has suppressed this research. Nobody issued a directive to close it down. The absence of systematic investigation is the product of ordinary institutional dynamics. Funding competition that disadvantages interdisciplinary work, disciplinary boundaries that make it hard for researchers in different fields to find and build on each other's work, heritage protection frameworks that add complexity to the research design, and the basic fact that there are always more interesting research questions than there are resources to pursue them. But ordinary institutional dynamics can produce outcomes that, from the outside, look remarkable. In this case, the outcome is that a pattern of evidence suggesting something genuinely unusual about the subsurface of one of the world's most important and oldest continuously inhabited landscapes has been sitting in archives and conference proceedings and internal government memos, mostly unread by the people who would need to read it collectively to understand what it was pointing toward. What would it mean if the evidence were followed up and confirmed? What would it mean if systematic geophysical survey of the priority locations produced consistent evidence of subsurface void structures, some of which showed characteristics suggesting modification by human activity rather than purely natural formation? The most conservative interpretation would be this: that Aboriginal Australians, over a period of tens of thousands of years in intimate relationship with a landscape whose geology includes natural void-forming processes, identified and used those natural voids for purposes that included shelter, water storage, preservation of culturally significant material, and ceremonial engagement. This would be archaeologically significant without being surprising. The use of natural caves and rock shelters is documented across the entire span of human prehistory on every continent where appropriate geological features exist. It would be remarkable only in the sense that the timescale involved, 60,000 years or more, is vastly longer than the archaeological record for cave use in most other parts of the world. The less conservative interpretation, which the evidence does not rule out, is that some of the modification described in the historical records and traditional knowledge is more extensive than the opportunistic use of natural features. That some of the spaces described involve a level of preparation or modification that implies sustained engagement over long periods, and that some of the description of sealing and deliberate concealment implies a purposive relationship with these spaces that goes beyond shelter or casual storage. Neither interpretation can be evaluated without the systematic survey that has been recommended repeatedly and never conducted. That is the frustrating circularity at the heart of this story. The evidence is interesting enough to generate recommendations for investigation, but not quite specific enough in any single thread to compel the investigation. The threads taken together are compelling, but the threads have never been taken together in a way that put them in front of the people with the institutional authority to allocate resources. There is a research methodology question embedded here that extends beyond this specific case. When knowledge exists in multiple forms and in multiple institutional locations, and when those forms of knowledge are not in dialogue with each other, the result can be that evidence which would be compelling if seen whole remains invisible because it is seen only in pieces. This is not a problem unique to Australian Aboriginal heritage research. It is a general problem of knowledge production in specialised and siloed institutions. But it has particular consequences in the Australian context because the most important form of knowledge about this landscape, the traditional ecological and geographical knowledge of people who have inhabited it for 60,000 years, is the form that is most systematically separated from the institutional processes by which research priorities are set and resources allocated. The Deep History of Australia project, which ran under the leadership of archaeologist Professor Bruno David at Monash University in the mid-2010s, demonstrated one model for what integration of these knowledge forms can produce. The project brought together archaeologists, geochemists, traditional knowledge holders, and community organisations across multiple regions of Australia to investigate questions about the long-term human history of specific landscape features. It produced findings that revised previously accepted dates and interpretations in several areas. It demonstrated that research designed from the outset to treat traditional knowledge as equally legitimate evidence, alongside physical and documentary evidence, produces different and more interesting results than research that treats traditional knowledge as contextual background. The Murray-Darling underground country question is precisely the kind of question that a project on the deep history model could address. The evidence threads are there. The traditional owner groups with the relevant knowledge are engaged in active cultural revitalization processes that create institutional capacity for collaboration. The geophysical methods are available and well understood. The archival research has been partially done. What is missing is the integration. A research program that brings the threads together, submits them to rigorous systematic investigation, and produces conclusions that can be evaluated by the normal standards of scientific evidence. In the absence of that research program, what can we say with confidence? We can say that multiple independent lines of evidence suggest that there are significant subsurface features in the Murray-Darling Basin that have not been systematically investigated. We can say that the traditional knowledge of multiple groups with deep knowledge of this landscape describes specific underground features at specific locations, with a level of geographical precision and physical specificity that has repeatedly corresponded to independent geological evidence. We can say that the historical record of colonial-era geological observation, pastoral industry experience, and heritage permit assessment documents anomalous subsurface conditions at locations that overlap significantly with the traditional knowledge descriptions. We can say that the pilot geophysical surveys that have been conducted produced results consistent with the existence of void structures, and that at least one of those results showed characteristics that are not readily explained by natural geological processes alone. And we can say that none of this has been followed up. The question of why that is the case has a structural answer that we have already examined, but there is another dimension to the question that deserves acknowledgement. The history of the relationship between Australian research institutions and Aboriginal Australians is not a history that encourages trust. Research conducted on Aboriginal people and communities without their genuine participation and without benefit to them is a history that goes from the craniometric collections of the 19th century to the native welfare research programs of the 20th century, with many stops between. The caution that traditional owner communities reasonably bring to research proposals involving their heritage and their country is not irrational. It is the product of experience. This means that any research program addressing the underground country question needs to be genuinely collaborative, not instrumentally collaborative. It needs to be designed with and for the traditional owner communities, not merely consented to by them. The intellectual property questions need to be resolved before the research begins. The publication and dissemination protocols need to reflect the community's interests and concerns. The research outputs need to serve the community's cultural revitalization goals as well as the academic research agenda. Research designed this way is more complex to plan and execute than standard academic research. It takes longer. It requires more sustained relationship building in the planning phase. It requires flexibility in methods and timelines that funding agencies sometimes find difficult to accommodate. These are real constraints. They are also not insurmountable. Several research programs in Australia have demonstrated that genuinely collaborative research of this kind can be done well and can produce results of high scientific quality alongside genuine benefit to the communities involved. The Sea Country Archaeology Program, which has mapped Aboriginal occupation sites on Australia's continental shelf, now submerged under the ocean that rose at the end of the last ice age, is one such program. It works at the intersection of marine archaeology, traditional knowledge, and geological survey, involves genuine community partnership, and has produced findings that have changed archaeologists' understanding of the deep history of Australian coastal occupation. The methodological framework it developed could serve as a model for inland underground country research. Let us go back to the river, back to the Murray at Tulibuck in September of 1863, to Edward Horatio Denby standing at the base of a slumped riverbank, looking at something his training had not prepared him to interpret. He wrote down what he saw. He wrote down the temperature anomaly. He wrote down what his Barkindji guide said. And then he moved on, because he had a survey to complete, and the survey had a defined scope, and whatever he was looking at was not within that scope. This is the founding moment of the pattern. Not a moment of suppression, not a moment of malice, a moment of a system encountering something it does not have the categories to process, and continuing to function by setting the anomaly aside. The anomaly did not go away. It waited. It waded through the irrigation surveys and the pastoral expansion and the river trade and the gold rushes and the Federation and the two world wars and the Reconstruction and the environmental movement and the native title era. The landscape above it changed beyond anything Denby could have imagined. The landscape below it changed very little, because landscapes below 10 meters of alluvial sediment change on geological timescales, not human ones. What was beneath the riverbank at Tulibuck in 1863 is, in all likelihood, still beneath the riverbank at Tulibuck now. Whatever Denby's probe rod encountered is still there. Whatever the Barkindji guide described as the old rooms under the river country is still there, in whatever form it takes and whatever it means. This is not a comfortable observation if you think about what it implies for how we understand human history in Australia. The standard account of Australian prehistory describes a population of hunter-gatherers living in a state of minimal material culture, leaving little physical trace and producing nothing that would require us to revise our understanding of what human beings were doing in the deep past. The standard account is not wrong in all its details, but it is built on a selective engagement with the evidence, one that privileges certain kinds of evidence. Archaeological deposits that fit existing interpretive frameworks, and systematically discounts or ignores others. The underground country evidence, if it were fully assembled and systematically investigated, would not necessarily overturn the standard account. It might confirm it while adding nuance. It might reveal practices and technologies that fit comfortably within the known range of human behavior in other archaeological contexts worldwide. It might reveal nothing more than the intelligent and sustained use of natural geological features by people who understood their landscape intimately. but it might reveal something that pushes the boundary of what we currently understand about human activity in deep time. It might reveal evidence of modification and use over time scales long enough to challenge existing assumptions about what was possible, what was attempted, and what was preserved. The Australian Creighton geology is ancient enough and stable enough that preservation over very long timescales is physically possible in a way that it is not in most other parts of the world. The traditional knowledge tradition is old enough and continuous enough that a correspondence between what it describes and what is physically present could reflect genuine knowledge transmission over timescales that dwarf the history of writing. These are not certainties. They are the kinds of questions that careful investigation could begin to address. And the failure to conduct that investigation, for the structural institutional reasons we have examined, is a failure that has consequences beyond the academic. It is a failure of our collective curiosity about who we are and where we come from. There is another layer to this story that has not yet been addressed. The question of why the underground country matters now, in the present, beyond its archaeological and historical significance. The Murray-Darling Basin is in crisis. It has been in various stages of ecological crisis for most of the past century, but the crisis deepened dramatically in the early 21st century. The millennial drought of the 2000 years, the most severe multi-year drought on record, reduced flows in the system to levels that killed the river red gums that are the iconic trees of the riverbank landscape, dried out wetlands that had been wet for recorded human history, and triggered a political and environmental crisis that culminated in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, the most ambitious attempt to restore sustainable water management to the system ever undertaken. One of the persistent problems in understanding the Murray-Darling system is the groundwater component. The surface water, the water that flows in the river channels, is relatively well measured and understood. The groundwater, the water that moves through the aquifer systems below the surface, is much less well understood, partly because it is harder to measure and partly because the aquifer system is complex enough that existing models do not fully capture its behavior. The underground country evidence is relevant here in a way that has not been explored. If there are significant void structures in the subsurface of the Murray Plain, particularly in the zone between the alluvial sediments and the underlying Creighton rock, those structures could affect groundwater movement and storage in ways that current hydrological models do not account for. The anomalous pressure behavior that Dr. Fitzallen documented in the 1990s cross-referencing the locations where the groundwater behaved unexpectedly might reflect not just the presence of void structures, but the role those structures play in the overall groundwater system. Understanding that role could have direct management implications. If certain void structures act as natural groundwater storage features, their location and character would be relevant to water management decisions. If certain features affect the movement of salinity through the groundwater system, understanding them could inform salinity management strategies. If the traditional knowledge of how underground water behaves at specific locations reflects genuine understanding of the groundwater system developed over thousands of years of observation, that knowledge could contribute directly to contemporary water management. This is not a speculative connection. The use of traditional ecological knowledge in water management is well established in parts of Australia where the research has been done to make the connection. In the Kimberley, knowledge of subsurface water sources held by traditional owners has informed groundwater management strategies. In Central Australia, traditional knowledge of water availability has been integrated into pastoral management planning. The principle that traditional knowledge systems accumulated over long periods of observation can contain information relevant to contemporary management decisions is not controversial. The application of that principle in the Murray-Darling context has simply not been attempted in any systematic way. The underground country of the Murray-Darling Basin is not a frozen archaeological question. It is a living landscape question, with living communities who carry relevant knowledge. It is a question whose answer, whatever that answer turns out to be, is relevant to the present management of a system that hundreds of thousands of people depend on for water security. The failure to investigate is not simply a failure of academic curiosity. It is a failure to use available knowledge. And in a landscape as stressed as the Murray-Darling Basin, the cost of failing to use available knowledge is not abstract. Now let us move to a different part of the continent, to the east coast, to the sandstone country of New South Wales, where the story has different characters and different evidence, but the same basic structure. The sandstone plateau of the Sydney Basin and its extensions north and south is geologically interesting in ways that are not obvious from the surface. The plateau country looks, from a distance, like flat tableland cut by dramatic gorges. Up close, in the gorges and along the escarpment edges, it resolves into extraordinary complexity. The sandstone is porous and fractured. The fracture systems create pathways for water and air movement. In places where the fracture systems intersect with softer sedimentary layers, solution processes can enlarge the fractures into passages. In places where the sandstone overhangs harder rock, overhangs and rock shelters form. In places where fractures intersect at depth, void spaces can develop that are not visible from the surface. The rock shelter tradition in the Sydney Basin is one of the most extensively documented in Australian archaeology. Thousands of rock shelters have been recorded across the region. Many have been excavated and their archaeological deposits analysed. Some have produced dates extending back 40,000 years or more. The shelters are not random. They cluster in locations with specific geological characteristics. Certain aspects, certain relationships to water sources, certain relationships to the surrounding landscape. There is a selection logic to where the shelters are. The Darug people, whose country covers much of the greater Sydney area and the Blue Mountains to the west, have a detailed understanding of the sandstone country that extends to features not visible from the surface. Darug knowledge of specific underground spaces, passages that connect sections of country that appear separated on the surface, cavities beneath plateau features that are not apparent from above, is part of the ceremonial and practical geography that was severely disrupted by the colonial period but has been partially preserved and is being actively revitalized. The disruption in the Darug case was particularly severe because the Sydney Basin was the site of first colonial settlement and experienced the most intensive early impact of any Aboriginal group in southeastern Australia. The 1789 smallpox epidemic, which reached the Sydney region before any colonial expansion beyond the immediate settlement area, killed an estimated half to two-thirds of the Aboriginal population within a year. The knowledge loss from that single event was catastrophic and largely irreversible. What was preserved by people who understood its value and took specific measures to maintain it, even under conditions of extreme disruption. The fragments that have been maintained and the fragments that have been recovered through subsequent research constitute a partial picture that is still being assembled. Within that partial picture, there are accounts of specific locations in the Blue Mountains escarpment country where underground features were described as significant by traditional knowledge holders in the early 20th century. These accounts were recorded by an ethnographer named Matilda Radcliffe Brown, working in the region in the 1920s, a period when the colonial disruption was severe enough that she was working with people who were themselves working from fragmentary knowledge. Her field notes, held at the University of Sydney Anthropology Department, contain 14 references to underground places in the mountains west of Sydney that were described by her informants with varying degrees of specificity. Radcliffe Brown was interested in social organisation, not underground geography, and her notes on underground places are incidental rather than systematic, but they exist. And they exist in a landscape whose geological character is consistent with the presence of the features described. A physical geographer at the University of Western Sydney, Dr. Karen Villanueva became interested in the Radcliffe-Brown underground place references in the course of research on geomorphological processes in the Blue Mountains. In 2007, she conducted a desktop analysis of the relevant landscape sections using digital elevation model data and geological survey maps, looking for surface expressions consistent with subsurface void features. She found 8 locations in the Blue Mountains escarpment zone, where the terrain data showed subtle features consistent with subsurface structural anomalies, in a distribution that partly overlapped with the locations given in the Radcliffe-Brown notes. Dr. Villanueva was cautious about her findings. She described them in a research note published in the journal Australian Geographer in 2009 as consistent with, but not proving the presence of significant subsurface features at the indicated locations, and noted that geophysical survey would be needed to assess the question. She was careful not to overstate the significance of the traditional knowledge references, given the indirect and fragmentary nature of the ethnographic record. The research note was published. It was cited by subsequent work on geomorphological methods in the Sydney Basin. It did not generate any follow-up investigation of the specific subsurface question. A different and more recent thread in the Blue Mountains story comes from an acoustic survey conducted in 2015 by a team from the University of Sydney's Archaeological Science Laboratory. The survey was designed primarily to assess the acoustic properties of documented rock shelter sites as part of a broader project on the acoustic dimensions of rock art. The project had been inspired by the work of acoustic archaeologist Igor Reznikov and his colleagues in European cave systems, who had demonstrated that the locations of cave paintings in French Paleolithic sites corresponded to sections of the caves with particularly powerful acoustic properties. The Sydney Basin Project, led by Dr. Michael Tennant, surveyed acoustic properties at 42 rock shelter sites across the Blue Mountains. The results showed a statistically significant correlation between sites with rich rock art and sites with elevated acoustic properties. More interesting for the underground country question was a secondary finding. At 6 of the 42 sites, the acoustic measurements showed anomalous reverberation characteristics that could not be explained by the geometry of the visible shelter. At these 6 sites, the reverberation time was significantly longer than would be expected given the size and shape of the shelter space, suggesting that the acoustic energy was reflecting from surfaces beyond the visible shelter walls. In acoustic terms, this can mean one of several things. It can mean that the survey conditions were unusual in some way that affected the measurements. It can mean that there are acoustic pathways through fractures in the rock that couple the shelter to the surrounding landscape. Or it can mean that the shelter is connected to a larger void space beyond the visible opening, and the acoustic energy is propagating into that space before reflecting back. At 2 of the 6 anomalous sites, Dr. Tennant's team conducted additional measurements designed to distinguish between these possibilities. The results at both sites were most consistent with the third explanation, a connected void space beyond the visible shelter. At one of these 2 sites, the location overlapped with one of the underground place references in the Radcliffe-Brown field notes. Dr. Tennant's report on the acoustic survey, submitted to the Australian Research Council as part of the project's final report, recommended geophysical follow-up at the 2 anomalous sites. The final report was accepted. The follow-up was not funded. At this point in the story, a listener might reasonably ask, what does it actually mean for a subsurface feature to be a vault? The word vault carries architectural connotations, a structure built by human hands with curved ceilings and deliberate dimensions. The word implies agency, intention, design. Is that what the evidence actually suggests? Or is the word itself doing rhetorical work that the evidence does not support? This is a fair question, and it deserves a careful answer. The evidence, taken across all the threads we have examined, does not unambiguously prove that any subsurface feature in any of the regions discussed is the product of deliberate human construction, in the sense of stone cutting or engineered excavation. The evidence is more subtle than that. It suggests, through multiple converging but not individually definitive threads, that there are subsurface features in these landscapes that do not have straightforward natural explanations, that traditional knowledge systems describe these features with precision and consistency that implies genuine knowledge of their character, and that some of the features described have characteristics, flat ceilings, anomalous temperature gradients, acoustic properties inconsistent with natural cavity geometry, that are at least as consistent with human modification or use as they are with purely natural formation. The word vault is useful not because it definitively describes the origin of the features, but because it captures something about their relationship to human knowledge and use. A vault is a space that has been integrated into human culture, that has been understood and employed and incorporated into the way people relate to their landscape. In that sense, whatever is beneath the Murray Plain and the Blue Mountains escarpment, whether it was shaped by human hands or shaped entirely by natural processes and then encountered and used and memorized and transmitted by human minds, has the character of a vault. It has been claimed by human knowledge. It exists in the record of human experience, even if it does not exist yet in the record of scientific investigation. And that gap between what human knowledge has claimed and what scientific investigation has confirmed is the mystery that this story is actually about. Not a mystery in the sensational sense of a secret hiding a revelation that will overturn everything. A mystery in the more ordinary sense of a question that has not been answered, waiting patiently in the dark beneath the floodplains and the sandstone plateaus of a continent whose human history is older and more complex than the institutions that study it have yet found ways to fully represent. Let us now consider the comparative context. Because the Australian underground country question is not as unique as it might appear, similar patterns of evidence and non-investigation appear in other parts of the world where indigenous knowledge systems intersect with geological features whose human significance has been underexplored. In southern Africa, the caves of the Drakensberg and the Cederberg have produced rock art assemblages that span tens of thousands of years, and that, like the Australian examples, correlate with acoustic anomalies in ways that suggest the artists were selecting locations partly on the basis of sonic properties. The research on this acoustic dimension has been done more thoroughly in the South African context than in the Australian one, and it has confirmed that the correlation is real and statistically significant. The implication that knowledge of underground acoustic features was embedded in the decision-making that produced some of the world's oldest art is now a mainstream hypothesis in the archaeology of southern Africa. In the Americas, the cenotes of the Yucatan Peninsula, the flooded sinkholes that form the surface expression of an extensive underground caste system, were sacred spaces in Maya cosmology. The archaeological investigation of the cenotes has documented extensive evidence of ritual use, sacrifice, and deliberate deposition of valuable objects going back thousands of years before the Spanish conquest. The traditional knowledge about which cenotes were significant and why has been partially preserved in colonial-era accounts and in living Maya communities, and that knowledge has guided archaeologists to finds that purely geological exploration would not have located. The cenote research demonstrates concretely what integrated traditional knowledge and scientific investigation can produce. In Northern Europe, the bog bodies of Denmark and Ireland and Britain, preserved by the chemical properties of peat environments, have revealed evidence of complex ritual practices associated with specific landscape features that were identified as significant by the people who used them. The traditional knowledge about those features, preserved fragmentarily in medieval Irish literature and in Scandinavian saga traditions, has sometimes corresponded to the archaeological evidence in ways that suggest the knowledge was not merely metaphorical. None of these parallels proves anything about what is beneath the Murray Plain, but they establish a pattern at the global scale that the Australian case fits. The pattern is that indigenous and traditional knowledge systems frequently encode accurate information about the physical character of specific landscape features, and that integrating that knowledge with scientific investigation produces results that purely scientific investigation, working without traditional knowledge, would not produce alone. The methodological implication is that the traditional knowledge is data. It is not the same kind of data as a geophysical measurement. It does not have the same precision or the same independence from observer interpretation. But it is data in the sense that it is information about the physical world derived from observation and transmitted through a reliable system. Treating it as data means taking its geographical specificity seriously, cross-referencing it with independent physical evidence, and investigating the correspondences that emerge, not accepting it uncritically, not dismissing it as mere belief, treating it the way a scientist treats any preliminary evidence, as a signal that directs investigation, subject to confirmation or disconfirmation by more rigorous methods. The Australian underground country evidence meets the standard for a signal. It has appeared across multiple independent data sets. It has shown internal consistency. It has produced specific predictions that have been partially confirmed by pilot investigations. It has been assessed by multiple researchers from multiple disciplines, and in each case generated a recommendation for further investigation. The further investigation has not happened, but the evidence does not expire. It is still there, in the archives and the field notes and the journal articles and the government memos, waiting. In 2019, a geologist working on a minerals exploration project in the Riverina district of southern New South Wales encountered something that brought all these threads back into focus, at least temporarily. His name was Dr. Daniel Osei, and he was conducting seismic reflection surveys for a mining company assessing the deep geology of a potential exploration license area. Seismic reflection works by sending acoustic pulses into the ground through geophones and measuring the pattern of reflections. It is primarily used to understand deep geological structure, but it also picks up features at shallower depths. At one location in the survey area, at a depth of approximately 9 to 15 meters, Dr. Osei's survey produced a reflection pattern that did not correspond to the expected stratigraphy. The reflection pattern showed a horizontal reflector at approximately 9 meters depth, extending for at least 60 meters in the survey direction, with a clear void signature below it. The horizontal reflector was too consistent in depth to be a natural sediment layer, which would vary in depth and character. It was more consistent in Dr. Osei's assessment, with a prepared surface, a floor. Dr. Osei's professional obligation was to report the deep geological results to his client. The shallow anomaly was not relevant to the mineral exploration program. He included a note about it in his technical report, described it as a potentially significant cultural heritage anomaly, and recommended that it be reported to the relevant state heritage authority. The mining company, operating under its heritage obligations, submitted the relevant section of the report to the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. The office received the report, noted the anomaly, and initiated a review process to determine whether further investigation was warranted. The review determined that the anomaly could not be confirmed as a cultural heritage item without further investigation, and that further investigation would require the agreement of the relevant traditional custodians. The office wrote to the local Aboriginal Land Council in the region, informing them of the anomaly and inviting their participation in a heritage assessment. The Land Council responded, indicating that they were aware of traditional knowledge about significant underground features in the general area, and that they supported further investigation in principle but required community consultation before providing formal consent. The community consultation process was initiated. It was not completed within the mining company's project timeline. The mineral exploration program moved forward. The heritage assessment was suspended pending the consultation process. The consultation process appears to have stalled, according to the Public Heritage Register in 2021. The anomaly Dr. Osei identified is in a location that, when mapped against the existing datasets, falls within the zone of overlap between the Barkindji traditional knowledge locations, documented in the 1990s, and the pastoral industry anomaly records collected by Dr. Hartley. The story of Dr. Osei's anomaly is not the end of anything. It is more evidence waiting in a pile of evidence that has been waiting for a long time. The question that follows naturally from everything we have examined is, what would actually happen if a systematic investigation were conducted? What would researchers find, and how would they know what they had found? Ground-penetrating radar is capable of detecting void spaces from the surface down to depths of about 30 meters in the geological conditions of the Murray Plain, with resolution sufficient to characterize the dimensions and internal structure of a void. Electrical resistivity tomography can supplement the GPR data and extend the depth range. Passive seismic monitoring, in which seismometers are left in place over an extended period to record natural ground vibrations, can detect void structures through the way they affect seismic wave propagation. These methods, used together, can map the location, dimensions, and some of the internal structure of subsurface void features without any invasive work. If the surveys confirm the presence of voids, the next stage would be to investigate their character. Non-invasive acoustic survey can assess the acoustic properties of a void through a narrow borehole, giving information about its dimensions and whether there are reflective surfaces within it. Borehole cameras can provide visual information about walls and floors. Air sampling through boreholes can detect the presence of organic material, which would have different implications depending on its nature and age. If any organic material were present, luminescence dating could give a minimum age for the last time the void was exposed to light. The sequence of investigation is well established in cave archaeology and in archaeological geophysics. It is not exotic. It requires specialized equipment and trained operators, but neither the equipment nor the expertise is scarce. What is required is the funding, the institutional organization, the community partnerships, and the sustained commitment to follow through on a research program that spans multiple years and multiple disciplines. What would make the results interpretively significant, and what would make them merely interesting? If the voids were confirmed as natural features with no evidence of human modification or use, the finding would update the geological map of the region in useful ways, but would not bear directly on the historical or archaeological questions. If the voids showed evidence of human use, in the form of organic deposits, worked surfaces, or artifacts, the questions about the nature and antiquity of that use would open up. The most significant finding would be evidence of deliberate modification. Surfaces prepared to a standard of regularity that exceeds what natural processes produce. Structural features that imply intentional shaping, or material evidence of sustained and purposive use over extended periods. Such evidence would require careful dating and characterization before interpretive conclusions could be drawn. And the dating question is where the story would become most interesting, because the potential time depth here is genuinely extraordinary. The geological stability of the Australian Craton means that features formed in it can survive for very long periods without significant modification by geological processes. The alluvial sediments of the Murray Plain accumulate slowly enough that features beneath them can be protected from erosion while remaining accessible from above. If features in these environments were used by human populations over the full span of Australian occupation, the oldest evidence of that use could be very old indeed. Luminescence, dating of sediment in contact with a worked surface. Uranium series dating of carbonate deposits on worked stone surfaces. Accelerator, mass spectrometry, dating of any preserved organic material. These methods could, under the right conditions, address the question of age with considerable precision. The oldest confirmed evidence of human activity in Australia currently dates to around 65,000 years ago from the Majidbebe site in the Northern Territory. The date is based on optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediment associated with stone artifacts and represents the most robust current estimate for the earliest human occupation of the continent. Whether earlier evidence exists, and where it might be found, is one of the active frontiers of Australian archaeology. 65,000 years of human presence in a geologically stable landscape with known natural void-forming processes creates conditions in which the potential time depth of any human engagement with underground features is genuinely very large. What a systematic investigation of the Murray-Darling underground country might contribute to understanding the deep history of Australian occupation is not predictable in advance, but the contribution could be significant. There is a dimension of this story that has not yet been addressed, and it is perhaps the most human dimension of all. It is the dimension of what it means to carry knowledge of a landscape across time under conditions of disruption, threat, and loss. The traditional knowledge that has been partially documented and that corresponds at specific locations and in specific ways to the physical character of the landscape beneath the Murray Plain and the Blue Mountains did not simply persist on its own. It was actively maintained. People made choices over hundreds of years of colonial disruption to keep transmitting it when they might have let it go. They found ways to maintain it under conditions that actively discouraged its maintenance. They taught it to the next generation in contexts where the teaching was dangerous or unwelcome, or conducted in secrecy, or conducted in conditions of such poverty and disruption that maintaining cultural knowledge was an extraordinary act of will. When Barkindji elders in the 1990s described underground country to researchers from UNSW, they were not simply sharing information they happened to remember. They were sharing information that had been kept alive through deliberate effort across generations of people who understood that it was worth keeping. The act of sharing it with researchers was itself a decision that the knowledge was ready to enter a different kind of system, to be translated into a different language, to seek a different form of confirmation. The Yorta Yorta Nation's engagement with academic research on their heritage has been shaped by the experience of the native title case, which was lost at the federal court level in 1998 on a legal reasoning that many legal scholars have criticized as fundamentally flawed. The judgment, which found that the Yorta Yorta had abandoned their traditional laws and customs through the disruption of colonial settlement, was experienced by the community as a profound injustice. It made them more rather than less committed to documenting and maintaining the traditional knowledge that the court had dismissed. The underground country knowledge, in the Yorta Yorta case, is part of a larger body of traditional knowledge that the community has been actively documenting and revitalizing since the native title case. It is part of what they maintain and assert as living connection to their country, not as a relic of the past, but as knowledge that has continuous relevance to understanding the landscape they live in and seek to protect. This is the context in which any research on the underground country question needs to be situated. Not as a purely academic investigation of an archaeological curiosity, as a partnership with communities whose relationship with the knowledge and with the landscape it describes is living and ongoing. The heritage protection framework that has developed in Australia since the 1990s, encompassing the Native Title Act, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, state-level heritage legislation, and the AITIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research provides the legal and ethical framework for such a partnership. The framework is not perfect. It has gaps and limitations that community advocates have repeatedly identified, but it establishes the principle that research involving Aboriginal cultural heritage requires genuine community partnership, that the community's interests must be central to the research design, and that the intellectual property generated by the research is not simply the property of the researchers or their institutions. A research program on the Murray-Darling underground country designed under this framework would look quite different from a standard academic research project. The research questions would be developed collaboratively with the traditional owner communities, not imposed by external researchers. The methods would be chosen partly on the basis of what the communities found acceptable, as well as what was scientifically optimal. The results would be shared with the communities before publication, and the community's interpretation of those results would be part of the published record alongside the scientific interpretation. The research infrastructure would include significant investment in the community's own capacity to conduct and interpret research about their heritage. This kind of research is more expensive and more complex than standard academic research. It is also more likely to produce results that are both scientifically significant and genuinely useful. The standard academic model for research on Aboriginal cultural heritage, in which researchers design projects, seek community consent as one step in an institutional process, and then publish results that primarily serve academic interests, has produced a large body of research that is regarded with justified skepticism by many Aboriginal communities. The collaborative model, in which communities are genuine partners in every stage of the research, produces research that communities trust and use, and that tends to produce better science because it has access to knowledge that the standard model treats as background context. The underground country question is one that needs the collaborative model not just for ethical reasons but for scientific ones. The traditional knowledge is not supplementary to the scientific investigation. It is, in the current state of evidence, the most specific and geographically precise information available about where significant features are likely to be found. Without it, a systematic geophysical survey would need to cover vast areas of ground in the hope of detecting something. With it, the survey can be directed to the specific locations where multiple independent evidence threads converge. In 2022, something happened that had not happened in the previous decades of fragmentary investigation. A group of researchers from 3 different institutions, having independently arrived at the Murray-Darling underground country question through different routes, organised a workshop in Albury at which they presented their work to each other and to representatives of the Barkindji Land Council, the Yorta Yorta Nation Aboriginal Corporation, and the Dja Dja Wurrung Clan's Aboriginal Corporation. The Albury workshop was not a formal research event. It had no institutional sponsor and no funding. It was organized by the initiative of 3 researchers who had discovered each other's work through the kind of informal communication that happens at the margins of academic conferences. Dr. Burke had tracked down a more recent paper by a geomorphologist at the University of Wollongong who had independently found the surface depression patterns in the Loddon Valley using newer satellite-derived elevation data. The Wollongong researcher, Dr. Annabelle Kwan, had read Dr. Schreiber's 2011 paper and extended the analysis. The two of them, comparing notes, realized they were addressing the same dataset from slightly different angles. They found Dr. Hartley through the conference proceedings paper, and he, now in retirement, was still interested in the question. He had maintained contact with some of the Barkindji Land Council staff from the 1990s UNSW Research Partnership and was able to make the introduction. The Albury workshop ran for 2 days. The researchers presented their independent work. The community representatives shared the aspects of their traditional knowledge that they were in a position to share with researchers who were, at that point, new acquaintances. The convergences between the different datasets were visible on a single map for the first time. The workshop produced an agreed statement that the participants would collectively pursue a new ARC linkage application, a grant mechanism designed specifically for research partnerships between universities and community or industry partners. The linkage mechanism allows community partners to contribute in-kind support that is counted against the total project budget, which reduces the cash funding required and, in principle, makes research involving community partners more competitive. The application was drafted collaboratively over the following 6 months. It was submitted in 2023. It requested funding for a 3-year project involving ground-penetrating radar survey at 8 priority locations, passive seismic monitoring at 4 of those locations, acoustic survey at 6 locations, and a systematic archival project to consolidate and digitize the historical records from the Geological Survey field reports, pastoral station records, and heritage permit archive. The application was reviewed. It received a rating of outstanding from the external reviewers, the highest category in the ARC's assessment scheme. It was not funded, because even outstanding rated applications are not funded if the available budget in the relevant assessment round does not extend to them. The research team was informed of this outcome in early 2024. They are planning a resubmission. This is where the story is now. Not closed, not abandoned, but waiting for the next step in a process that has been generating evidence for more than 160 years without producing the systematic investigation that the evidence calls for. The 12 priority locations identified in the overlapping datasets still exist beneath the Murray Plain. The acoustic anomalies in the Blue Mountains rock shelters still await the geophysical follow-up that would confirm or disconfirm the void signature interpretation. The 31 anomaly observations in the Geological Survey of Victoria field reports are still in the Public Record Office, Victoria under reference VPRS 625, legible to anyone who goes there and reads them. Edward Horatio Denby's field notebook for September 1863 is still in the same archive, at a slightly different reference number. And the entry for the 14th of September still says what it says about the temperature of the air and the character of the surface, and what the Barkindji guide said about the old rooms under the river country. The Barkindji themselves and the Yorta Yorta and the Jaja Wurrung are still here. They have not gone anywhere, despite everything that was done over the past 200 years to ensure that they would. Their connection to their country is not a relic. Their knowledge is not frozen, it has adapted and survived and is being actively maintained and transmitted to new generations who are growing up knowing that their country has depths that the standard maps do not show. The mystery is not, in the end, a mystery about what is beneath the ground. It may be a mystery about what is beneath the ground, and the investigation might resolve it in ways that surprise everyone, or it might reveal something more ordinary than the convergent evidence threads suggest, or it might reveal something so extraordinary that the field of Australian archaeology needs to revise itself substantially. All of those outcomes are genuinely possible. But the deeper mystery, the one that does not require any geophysical confirmation, is the mystery of the gap between knowledge and investigation. The mystery of how a pattern of evidence so consistent and so multiply confirmed can sit in a landscape for more than 160 years of systematic documentation without generating the systematic response that the documentation clearly calls for. That mystery has a structural explanation, as we have examined. But having an explanation does not make it less mysterious. It makes it more so. Because the structural explanation, the disciplinary silos, and the funding competition and the interdisciplinary disadvantage and the heritage protection complexity is an explanation of how ordinary institutional processes produce extraordinary failures. And that is a category of mystery that applies not just to this question, not just to Australia, but to every case in which a genuine question about human history sits in an archive being patient while the systems that should investigate it are busy with other things. The questions that sit in the archives of the oldest continuously inhabited continent on Earth are not in a hurry. They have been waiting for a long time. They will continue to wait, with the geological patience of limestone dissolving in groundwater, of sediment accumulating over buried features at the rate of 1 millimeter per year, of traditional knowledge moving through generations like water through an aquifer, not visible at the surface, not measurable with simple instruments, but present and moving and connected to something very deep. Let us now examine the evidence more carefully than we have done so far, because the story deserves more than a general account of convergent threads. It deserves the specific texture of what researchers actually found when they looked closely. The VPRS 625 series in the Public Record Office, Victoria, contains the field reports of the Geological Survey of Victoria from the colony's first decades. The reports are handwritten in the formal copper plate style of Victorian official correspondence. They were written by men who were primarily concerned with the economic geology of the colony: the gold, the copper, the coal, the limestone. Their observations on anomalous subsurface features were incidental to their primary purpose, which is exactly why those observations are valuable. They were not looking for underground heritage sites. They were not trying to document anything that might conflict with the dominant colonial narrative about the nature of Aboriginal life. They were simply recording what they encountered. The Geological Survey field report that provides one of the most detailed accounts in the entire VPRS 625 series was written by a geologist named Thomas Cartwright in 1877, in connection with a survey of the Murray Plain between Kerrang and Swan Hill. Cartwright had been sent to assess the limestone deposits in the region, which the colonial government was interested in for road-building material. In the course of his survey, he and his team sank a series of probe boreholes in the flat country west of the Murray to assess the depth and character of the limestone below the surface alluvial cover. At one of these boreholes, at a location Cartwright described as approximately 4 miles west-southwest of the present-day town of Koondrook, the borehole encountered an unexpected result at a depth of 7 feet from the surface. The probe passed through the alluvial layer, as expected, and then instead of encountering the expected limestone, encountered what Cartwright described as an open void space of considerable extent, the lateral dimensions of which could not be determined by borehole alone. This was not remarkable in itself. Limestone dissolution can produce void spaces, and the country was known to have limestone underlying the alluvium. What Cartwright found unusual was the character of the void surfaces he could assess through the borehole. Using a directional probe and a small lantern on a lowered line, he was able to make some observations about the walls of the void at the borehole location. His report states that the wall surfaces at the borehole location were remarkably smooth and uniform in character, quite unlike the irregular dissolution surfaces typical of limestone karst, and that the floor of the void, which he could see below his lantern position, was flat and appeared level across its extent. He reported the temperature of air drawn up the borehole as noticeably cooler than the surface temperature, consistent with a void in thermal equilibrium with the subsurface rather than the surface environment. He noted a faint but consistent air movement through the borehole, suggesting the void was connected to another opening at a different location. Cartwright also noted, almost as an afterthought at the end of the entry, that the Aboriginal men working with the survey team became very quiet when the borehole was sunk at this location, and that one of them, whom Cartwright identifies only as Old Billy, made a statement in language that another team member, a man described as a half-caste interpreter, translated approximately as "This is one of the old hidden rooms of the Wemba Wemba." The Wemba Wemba are a Kulin nation group whose country covers much of the northern plains of Victoria. They are related by language and kinship to the Barkinji, the Yorta Yorta, and the Jaja Wurrung. Their traditional knowledge of the Murray Plain would have included knowledge of the same underground country traditions that appear in the documentation of those adjacent groups. Cartwright's report continues past this observation without comment on its significance. The borehole at the Koondrook location was noted as producing inadequate access to the limestone deposits for the survey's purposes. The team moved on. The report was submitted and filed. The location of the Koondrook borehole, at approximately 4 miles west-southwest of Koondrook in 1877, falls within the zone identified in both the Barkinji traditional knowledge documentation from the 1990s and the pastoral industry records collected by Dr. Hartley as a location with anomalous subsurface character. It is one of the 9 locations in the core overlap dataset. Dr. Bork has not surveyed this specific location. It remains one of the 12 priority sites in the unexecuted research program. When Dr. Ashby found the Cartwright report in the course of his La Trobe archival research, he described his reaction in terms that anyone who has spent time in archives will recognize. He had been reading field reports for weeks, encountering occasional anomaly observations and logging them carefully, maintaining the systematic skepticism that archival research requires. And then he read the Cartwright entry and understood immediately that he was looking at something different in kind from the other observations. Not because the observation was more dramatic, but because the level of specificity and the quality of the observer's attention were both higher. Cartwright was, by the standards of his time, a skilled and careful geological observer. His reports throughout the VPRS 625 series show consistent attention to evidence and appropriate caution in interpretation. He did not interpret the Koondrook anomaly as a cultural heritage site or as evidence of anything beyond a natural geological feature of unusual character. But his description of the flat floor, the smooth walls, the thermal anomaly, the air movement, and the reaction of the Wemba Wemba workers is precise enough to be genuinely useful to a researcher approaching the question from 140 years later. Dr. Ashby photographed the Cartwright entry. He included it as one of the core cases in his conference proceedings paper. When he and Dr. Bork and Dr. Hartley and Dr. Kearney met in that Melbourne cafe in 2009 and spent the afternoon comparing notes. The Cartwright entry was one of the pieces of evidence on the table. The pastoral station record that corresponds most closely to the Cartwright observation comes from a station called Koondrook Park, which was operating in the area during the 1880s. The station records, held in the Public Record Office, Victoria, under a different series reference, include a manager's report from 1884 describing the sinking of a bore for a stock watering point. The report describes the bore striking a void at approximately the same depth as Cartwright's borehole, and notes that the void was too large to fill effectively and had to be bridged over with timber. The manager's report adds that the station's Aboriginal workers would not work near the bore once it had been opened, and had explained through the station's interpreter that the place was known to them as one of the underground chambers that the old people used in the long ago time. The station manager treated this as a curiosity and a nuisance. He had a watering point to install. He bridged the void and moved on. The report does not say whether the void was mapped or its extent assessed. The watering point installation presumably sealed the borehole opening. Whatever was beneath it in 1884 is presumably still there. These two accounts, the Cartwright Geological Survey report from 1877 and the Koondrook Park Station Manager's report from 1884, describe what appear to be the same feature from different directions, 7 years apart. They are consistent in depth, in character, and in the response of the Aboriginal workers present. They were written by men who did not know each other, for different audiences and different purposes, neither of whom would have had any reason to fabricate or exaggerate what they observed. This is the character of the strongest evidence in the Murray-Darling dataset. Not a single dramatic discovery, but the accumulation of consistent, independent observations from people writing for practical purposes who had no motive to invent what they described. The consistency across observers who did not know each other's work, writing across decades, is a form of reliability. It is not certainty, but it is a basis for investigation. The Wemba Wemba connection in the Cartwright report opens another dimension of the story that has been only partially explored. The Wemba Wemba, whose country centres on the Loddon-Murray Junction and the northern Victorian plains, are one of the Kulin nations that came together in the alliance system documented by colonial observers in the middle of the 19th century. The Kulin nations, covering the country from the eastern coast to the Murray Plain, had a sophisticated system of intergroup relationships, ceremonial exchange, and shared governance that is one of the more extensively documented examples of pre-colonial political organisation in southeastern Australia. Within that system, knowledge of specific landscape features, including underground features, would have been shared in specific ways, with specific protocols. Knowledge was not freely available to anyone who asked. It was held by particular custodians, transmitted through particular relationships, shared in particular ceremonial contexts. The Wemba knowledge of underground chambers, described by Cartwright's informant, would have been part of a larger network of knowledge held by the Kulin nations collectively, with each group holding the knowledge most specific to their own country and sharing relevant knowledge with related groups through ceremonial and kinship networks. What this means for the research question is that the traditional knowledge of underground country in the Murray-Darling Basin is not a collection of isolated local observations. It is part of a connected system of geographical knowledge that covered a very large area and that was maintained through a sophisticated social and ceremonial infrastructure. The consistency of the underground country descriptions across the Barkindji, Yorta, Diar Wurrung, and Wemba groups, which are related but distinct nations with different but adjacent countries, is therefore not surprising. It reflects the connected character of the knowledge system that maintained and transmitted the information. It also raises the possibility that the underground features known to the Kulin and adjacent nations are not isolated local oddities, but part of a larger pattern of significant subsurface geography across a much bigger area than has yet been assessed. The Murray Plain is a large landscape. The zone of geological conditions capable of producing significant void structures extends across much of southern Australia. If the features known to one group of traditional owners correspond to real geological anomalies, the analogous features known to related groups in adjacent country might also correspond to real geological anomalies. This is a hypothesis, not a finding. It would require the same kind of systematic investigation to assess as the specific locations already identified. But it points to the scale of what might be involved if the research program that has been stalled for decades were actually conducted. The scale of the question is one reason why it has been difficult to address within the normal academic funding framework. A full assessment of the underground country question across all the relevant traditional owner groups and all the relevant geological zones in southeastern Australia would be a multi-year, multi-institution research program of significant scope. It is not the kind of question that can be resolved in a 3-year grant cycle. It is more like the Sea Country program, which took more than a decade to produce its key results, or the Majedba Bay excavation at Kakadu, which required sustained commitment from researchers and community partners over many years before it produced the results that revised the dating of Australian occupation. The underground country question deserves that kind of sustained commitment. It deserves it for the intellectual reasons we have examined: the convergent evidence, the geographical precision of the traditional knowledge, the geological context that makes significant features physically possible, the historical record of consistent independent observations. And it deserves it for the reasons that go beyond the purely intellectual. The significance of the question for understanding human history in the oldest continuously inhabited continent on Earth, the relevance of the knowledge to contemporary landscape management, and the respect owed to communities who have maintained and transmitted knowledge under conditions that would have destroyed it had those communities not been committed to keeping it alive. There is a question that people who are new to this subject almost always ask when they first encounter the evidence. If there are real underground features here, why have the communities not simply led researchers to them directly? Why is the research being done through archival cross-referencing and geophysical surveys rather than through direct guided access? The answer to this question has several layers, and each layer is important. The first layer is straightforward. Many of the underground country locations are sacred sites. Access to them is not for everyone, in the same way that access to any significant sacred site anywhere in the world is not simply open to whoever happens to be curious. The knowledge of which locations are significant and what they are significant for is held within specific custodial frameworks that determine who has access to what knowledge under what circumstances. A researcher expressing academic interest in underground heritage is not automatically the right person to have direct access to a sacred site, regardless of how legitimate their interest may be. The second layer relates to the nature of the disruption that the communities have experienced. When a knowledge tradition has been severely disrupted over multiple generations, not all knowledge holders have complete knowledge. Individual knowledge holders may have detailed knowledge of some locations and partial knowledge of others. The process of cultural revitalization involves careful assessment of what is known completely, what is known partially, and what has been lost. Taking researchers to locations before that assessment is complete and before the community has collectively determined what it is prepared to share and under what conditions is not something communities undertake lightly. The third layer is the one that speaks most directly to the character of the evidence we have been examining. In many cases, the traditional knowledge of underground place locations is not straightforwardly spatial in the way that a set of GPS coordinates is spatial. The knowledge is relational. It describes locations in terms of relationships between landscape features, seasonal conditions, ceremonial contexts, and other locations. Translating that relational knowledge into the kind of spatial data that a geophysical survey requires is itself a research task that requires sustained partnership, not a one-time guided visit. This is one of the reasons why the research proposals that have been developed over the years and that have not been funded have consistently proposed community partnership as central to the methodology, rather than as a compliance requirement. The partnership is not just ethically necessary, it is methodologically necessary. The traditional knowledge is not a set of coordinates to be read off and verified. It is a form of information about the landscape that requires the active participation of the knowledge holders to translate into forms that are useful for systematic scientific investigation. And this is also why the failure to fund the research is a failure that falls hardest on the communities, not just on the researchers. The researchers can move on to other questions, as most of them have done. The communities cannot move on from the question of their own heritage. The failure to invest in the research means that the question of what is beneath their country remains unresolved, not for them as an abstract intellectual matter, but as a living question about the character and meaning of the land to which they have the deepest possible connection. The underground country, whatever it is, and whatever it means, is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is part of the geography of belonging. It is part of what the land means to the people who have known it for 60,000 years. Whether it turns out to be a network of naturally occurring karst voids used opportunistically for storage and shelter, or something more complex and more deliberately shaped, the question of its character and its history is a question that belongs to the communities whose ancestors knew it, and whose descendants maintain the knowledge of it. The systematic scientific investigation that the evidence calls for is, from this perspective, not primarily a service to academic knowledge. It is a service to the communities whose heritage is at stake. It is an investment in the full and accurate account of human history in a landscape that has been inhabited longer than any other. In 2021, a small event occurred that has not been widely reported, but that represents a kind of milestone in the long, slow, mostly invisible history of this research question. A hydrologist with the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, a woman named Dr. Frances Morrow, was conducting routine assessment of groundwater monitoring data from the northern Victorian aquifer zones when she noticed something in the data from a cluster of monitoring bores in the Koondrook district. The monitoring bores are sunk into the aquifer system to track water pressure and chemistry as part of the basin-wide water management program. The data they generate is primarily used for water management decisions. But the data is also, incidentally, a continuous record of subsurface conditions at specific locations. Dr. Morrow's attention was caught by the fact that 3 monitoring bores in the Koondrook cluster were showing correlated pressure anomalies, fluctuations that occurred at roughly the same time in all 3 bores, but were not reflected in the other monitoring bores in the region. Correlated pressure anomalies in multiple bores can indicate that the bores are monitoring a connected subsurface system rather than isolated points in a uniform aquifer. They can indicate that there is a pathway connecting the water at the 3 bore locations that does not connect to the rest of the monitoring network. In practical terms, this is a hydrological anomaly worth investigating. Dr. Morrow wrote a brief technical note about the anomaly and included it in the quarterly monitoring report. She looked at the spatial distribution of the 3 bores and noted that they fell in a rough triangle with the Kundruk township at its center, in an area she described as geographically consistent with the anomalous subsurface features noted in the Geological Survey field reports from the 1870s that she had come across in the course of background research for an earlier project. She was referring, without knowing its full context, to the Cartwright report from 1877. Dr. Morrow's technical note was included in the quarterly monitoring report. The quarterly monitoring report was submitted to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and to the Victorian and New South Wales government departments that receive such reports. The anomaly was noted and classified as requiring further assessment in the next monitoring cycle. The further assessment, as of the time this account was compiled, has not been prioritized above other monitoring program activities. But Dr. Morrow had, without knowing it, added one more data point to a dataset that had been accumulating since Edward Horatio Denby probed a slumped riverbank in September of 1863 and found something he could not explain. The dataset now includes the Denby field note from 1863, the Cartwright Geological Survey report from 1877, the Kundruk Park Station Manager's report from 1884, the Barkindji Traditional Knowledge Documentation from the 1990s, the Groundwater Anomaly Cross-Reference by Dr. Fitzallen from 1998, the Archival Analysis by Dr. Ashby from the La Trobe Conference Proceedings in 2001, the Ground-Penetrating Radar Surveys by Dr. Bork from 2004, the Pastoral Records Analysis by Dr. Hartley from his seminar in 2009, the Heritage Permit Analysis from the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council in 2013, the Seismic Reflection Data from Dr. Osei's Minerals Exploration Survey from 2019, and the Groundwater Monitoring Correlation noted by Dr. Morrow in 2021, 11 independent pieces of evidence assembled by people who mostly did not know about each other's work, spanning more than 160 years of observation, all pointing toward the same small area of the Murray Plain near Kundruk as a location where something significant and unexplained exists beneath the surface. None of this constitutes proof. Proof is what systematic investigation produces, and systematic investigation has not been conducted. What this constitutes is a pattern of evidence that is not credibly explained by coincidence, and that has been consistent and accumulating for long enough that ignoring it is itself a decision that requires justification. The justification that has effectively been offered, not in a formal statement but through the accumulated effect of funding decisions and institutional priorities, is that the question is not urgent enough, not sufficiently clearly defined, not aligned enough with existing research priorities, to displace the other demands on the available resources. This is not an unreasonable justification in the abstract. There are many more interesting questions than there are resources to pursue them. All research programs involve choices about priority. But when the question involves the heritage of communities that have been systematically dispossessed and whose knowledge systems have been actively suppressed, and when the question has been generating evidence for more than a century and a half, the ordinary justification for non-investigation carries additional weight. The weight of what has already been lost through delay, the weight of what is still at risk through continued inaction, the weight of the obligation that comes with inhabiting a continent whose human history extends tens of thousands of years beyond the horizon of what its current institutions have been built to understand. That weight does not resolve the practical difficulties of funding and institutional design, but it should be part of the conversation about how to address those difficulties. Beyond the Murray-Darling Basin, in the sandstone country of the Sydney Basin, and in the limestone karst of the southeastern coast, and in the volcanic plains of Western Victoria, there are analogous patterns. Different geologies, different traditional owner groups, different historical records, but the same basic structure. Traditional knowledge describing specific underground features, historical records documenting colonial-era encounters with anomalous subsurface conditions, pilot scientific investigations producing results that call for follow-up, and the follow-up consistently not happening. The volcanic plains of Western Victoria are particularly interesting because the geology there is so obviously capable of producing significant underground features. The newer volcanics province of Western Victoria, which extends from Melbourne westward to the South Australian border, is one of the most recently active volcanic regions in Australia. The most recent eruptions occurred approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a period well within the span of human occupation of the region. The lava flows from those eruptions created tube caves, the tunnels left by lava that drained from a solidified outer crust, similar to the lava tubes found in Hawaii and Iceland and the Canary Islands. The lava tubes of Western Victoria are known and some have been explored. What is less known and essentially unstudied in the context of human heritage is the relationship between those lava tubes and the traditional knowledge of the groups whose country they run through. The Dja Wurrung people, related to the Dja Dja Wurrung, have traditional country in the central Western Victoria volcanic plains. The Gunditjmara people, whose sophisticated aquaculture system at Budj Bim was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019, have country adjacent to the volcanic plains in the west. The Gunditjmara case is instructive in this context because it demonstrates what happens when systematic investigation of underground country is actually undertaken in a collaborative framework. The Budj Bim cultural landscape, centered on the Tyrendera lava flow in southwestern Victoria, includes a complex of channels, weirs, and dams constructed by the Gunditjmara over 6,000 years for the management of short-finned eel populations. This was not a simple system. It was an engineered landscape of considerable sophistication, using the natural topography of the lava flow and the hydrological behavior of the adjacent wetlands to create a controlled environment for sustainable protein production. Before the systematic archaeological investigation of Budj Bim that led to the UNESCO nomination, the existence of this system was known to the Gunditjmara, but was not part of the standard archaeological understanding of pre-colonial Aboriginal technology. The system had been documented in fragments in colonial-era records and in some archaeological surveys, but had not been assembled into a coherent picture of its full extent and character. The Gunditjmara's own knowledge of the system and their role as collaborators in the archaeological investigation was essential to producing the understanding that made the UNESCO nomination possible. The Budj Bim outcome is the model for what collaborative investigation can produce. It revealed a technology and a management system of genuine world significance that the standard archaeological approach, working without genuine community partnership, had failed to appreciate in more than a century of research in the region. The underground country question in the Murray-Darling Basin is a different kind of question, involving different geological features and different traditional knowledge frameworks, but the methodological lesson is the same. Systematic investigation in genuine partnership with traditional owner communities can reveal things that the standard approach misses. The Dja Wurrung lava tube country, between the Gunditjmara country to the southwest and the Dja Dja Wurrung country to the northeast, is a geological zone with extensive underground features that have not been systematically investigated in relation to traditional knowledge. The lava tubes that have been explored are known primarily through the interests of recreational cavers and geological surveyors. Their relationship to Dja Wurrung traditional knowledge, and whether that knowledge provides information about features not yet mapped by scientific survey, has not been systematically assessed. This is not because the question has never been raised. A geologist working on the volcanic plains in the 1980s noted in field reports, now in the Geological Survey of Victoria archive, that Aboriginal informants had described underground passages in the volcanic country that differed in character from the lava tubes the geologist had mapped. The informants described passages that were cooler and drier than the lava tubes, with floors described as flat and level in a way that the lava tube floors, which follow the irregular surface of the underlying basalt, would not be. The geologist noted this as an interesting observation, speculated that it might reflect knowledge of a different category of underground feature, possibly a phreatic cave rather than a lava tube, and recommended that the area be surveyed for such features. The recommendation was not followed up. The field report sits in the Geological Survey archive, accessible to anyone who looks for it. The Gippsland Ranges in eastern Victoria, the third cluster in Dr. Ashby's mapping of the Geological Survey anomaly observations, have their own tradition of underground country knowledge. The Gunai Kurnai people, whose country spans the Gippsland Lakes and the surrounding ranges, have maintained knowledge of specific underground features in the ranges that has been documented in several contexts since the early 20th century. The Clogs Cave site in the Buchan Karst area of the eastern Gippsland Ranges is one of the most archaeologically significant cave sites in Australia. Excavated by Josephine Flood in the 1970s, it produced dates extending to around 17,000 years ago and, remarkably, excavated ritual sticks, whose form corresponds precisely to the implements documented in white ethnographer A.W. Howart's accounts of Gunai Kurnai ceremonial practices in the 1880s. The correspondence between 17,000-year-old artifacts and the living ceremonial tradition documented a century and a half ago is one of the most striking demonstrations in Australian archaeology of the continuity of cultural knowledge over extended time periods. The Clogs Cave example is relevant to the underground country question because it demonstrates that Gunai Kurnai cultural knowledge about specific underground places has been maintained in forms that correspond to the physical evidence found at those places. If that is true for Clogs Cave, which is a documented archaeological site, it raises the question of whether it is also true for underground places described in Gunai Kurnai traditional knowledge that have not yet been systematically investigated. The Buchan Karst system, of which Clogs Cave is one element, is extensive. The Buchan Caves, a nearby tourist site, represent a fraction of the system that has been surveyed. The full extent of the karst beyond the surveyed sections is not known. Within the unsurveyed sections, the geological conditions are capable of producing significant void structures, and the Gunai Kurnai traditional knowledge of the ranges includes accounts of underground places that have not been correlated with systematic geological survey. A researcher at Federation University in Ballarat, Dr. Ruth Abrahams, conducted a preliminary comparison of Gunai Kurnai underground place accounts documented in the 20th century against the existing geological survey data for the Buchan Karst in 2016. The comparison identified 7 locations in the traditional knowledge accounts for which the geological data showed features consistent with the presence of significant underground spaces. She submitted a conference abstract on this finding to the Australian Archaeological Association conference in 2017. The abstract was accepted. She presented the findings. The response from the conference audience was interested and collegial. No research partnership or funding proposal resulted. Dr. Abrahams published a brief research note in the Journal of Australian Studies in 2018, noting the 7 location correspondences and recommending systematic assessment. The note was published. It was read by its small audience. It has not generated systematic follow-up. The Buchan Karst underground country question, added to the Murray Plain question and the Blue Mountains question and the Western Victoria Volcanic Plains question, creates a picture of a continent-spanning pattern in which significant subsurface features described in traditional knowledge, corroborated by independent historical and scientific evidence, are awaiting investigation in multiple geological zones across the continent's southeastern quarter. Each instance of this pattern is, by itself, a question worth pursuing. Together, they suggest something larger, that the underground dimension of Australia's human heritage has been systematically under-investigated, and that the traditional knowledge systems that hold the most specific and geographically precise information about that dimension are the forms of knowledge that the research institutions best positioned to conduct the investigation have been least equipped to integrate. This is the character of the mystery that the title of this story announces, not the mystery of hidden treasure or suppressed secrets. The mystery of an obvious question that has been sitting in plain sight for more than a century and a half, generating evidence at a steady pace, and never receiving the systematic response that its evidence base clearly warrants. The vaults beneath Australia are mysterious, not primarily because of what they contain or what they are. They are mysterious because the knowledge of their existence has been sitting in two places simultaneously. In the archives of colonial-era institutions that recorded what they encountered without knowing what to make of it, and in the traditional knowledge systems of the people who knew exactly what those features were and what they meant, but who were not in a position to direct the resources required to confirm that knowledge in the terms that would make it legible to the institutions that control those resources. The gap between those two locations, between the colonial archive and the traditional knowledge system, is the gap through which the mystery has persisted. Closing it, or narrowing it, requires not just resources, but a different way of thinking about whose knowledge counts, what forms of evidence deserve investigation, and what obligations we carry toward the landscapes and the people whose histories we have inherited without fully understanding. Let us now think about what a different future looks like. Not the future in which the ARC linkage application is submitted and not funded for the fourth time, and the researchers move on, and the 12 priority locations continue to wait. A different future in which the research happens and produces results. In this different future, the systematic geophysical survey of the 12 priority locations in the Murray-Darling Basin begins in the autumn of a year not too far from now. The research team is genuinely interdisciplinary. Geophysicists, archaeologists, hydrologists, anthropologists, and, centrally, Barkindji and Yorta Yorta and Jar Jar Wurrung cultural knowledge holders who are paid for their expertise and who have meaningful authority over research design and data management. The survey proceeds location by location, the ground-penetrating radar transects, generating the raw data that the geophysicists process and the knowledge holders interpret in the context of their country's traditional geography. At the Koondrook location, the survey confirms what the 1,877 Cartwright report and the 1,884 Koondrook Park Station record and the Barkindji traditional knowledge and the correlating hydrological monitoring data all suggested. There is a significant void structure beneath the Murray Plain at this location. The GPR data shows its extent and internal structure in detail, sufficient to design a borehole investigation. The internal structure is complex, more complex than a simple natural dissolution void, with features that the geophysicists describe in their preliminary interpretation as consistent with a connected system of spaces. The borehole investigation follows. Acoustic survey through the borehole confirms the void's acoustic character. Air sampling detects organic compounds consistent with the presence of preserved organic material in the deeper sections of the void. Borehole camera imaging shows wall surfaces at the borehole location that are smooth and consistent in character, with a section of the floor visible below the borehole terminus that is flat and level. The research team meets with the community representatives to discuss what has been found and what it means in the context of the traditional knowledge. The community representatives, seeing the borehole images and the geophysical data laid out together, describe what the features shown are called in their tradition, what their significance is, what the protocols are for interacting with them, and what the tradition says about their history. The conversation that follows, between the geophysicists' interpretation of the physical evidence and the community knowledge holders' interpretation of the same evidence through the framework of their tradition, is the conversation that has been waiting to happen since Edward Horatio Denbigh wrote in his field notebook in September of 1863 about what his Barkindji guide had said. The results of this conversation and the further investigation it generates cannot be predicted in advance. That is why the investigation matters. The outcome is genuinely unknown. The evidence suggests something significant is there, but the character and meaning and age of that something are questions that only the investigation can answer. What can be predicted is that the investigation, conducted properly, will produce knowledge of the human history of the Murray-Darling landscape that is currently unavailable. Knowledge that will be relevant to the communities whose heritage it concerns. Knowledge that will contribute to understanding one of the world's most important and oldest human landscapes. Knowledge that the evidence has been pointing toward for more than 160 years. That investigation has not happened yet. It might happen soon. It might take another decade. The land, as it has done for 60,000 years, will wait. The patience of the land and the patience of the knowledge are not infinite. They are very old and very durable, but they are not infinite. The Barkindji elders, who shared what they knew with the UNSW researchers in the 1990s, are not all alive now. The traditional knowledge systems that have maintained this information through conditions of extraordinary disruption are still operating. But the people who carry the knowledge are people with lives and health and limits, not abstract repositories. The archival records are paper and ink, subject to the ordinary processes of decay and misfiling and institutional reorganization. The geological features themselves are geologically stable, but the hydrological systems above them are being altered by extraction and climate change in ways that affect the conditions under which they might eventually be accessed. There is a time dimension to the urgency of this research that is easy to overlook when thinking about evidence that has been patient for 160 years. The evidence has been patient. The conditions that produce the evidence and that make it interpretable are not static. This is the note on which the story of the vaults beneath Australia currently rests. Not resolved, not abandoned. Waiting, in the way that evidence waits, and the way that land waits, and the way that knowledge maintained through 60,000 years of human presence waits for the moment when the instruments and the will and the partnerships and the resources align sufficiently to finally, properly, seriously ask the question that the evidence has been trying to answer for more than a century and a half. The question is simple. The question is, what is down there? The answer is not yet known. But the knowledge that there is something to know, and that the knowledge of what it is and what it means has been held and transmitted and maintained by the oldest living continuous cultures on Earth, is not in question at all. The question of what is down there inevitably raises a deeper question about how we know what we know about the past, and specifically about the deep past of human activity in landscapes, where the standard instruments of historical knowledge, written records, dated artifacts recovered from excavation, architectural remains visible on the surface, are either absent or incomplete. Australia is the extreme case of this challenge. The continent was inhabited for 60,000 years, perhaps longer, before the introduction of any form of writing. The archaeological record of that 60,000-year occupation is extensive in some respects and radically incomplete in others. The extensive parts are primarily the stone tool assemblages, the rock art, the shell middens at coastal sites, and the handful of carefully excavated stratified deposits like Majidbeeb and Clogg's Cave that give us dated sequences of occupation. The radically incomplete parts include everything that was made from organic material and has not been preserved, everything that is submerged under the sea that has risen since the last ice age, and everything that is underground in contexts that have not been systematically investigated. The underground category is the least explored. it is less explored than the submarine prehistory, which has received growing attention in the Sea Country program. It is certainly less explored than the surface archaeology, which has been the focus of mainstream Australian archaeological research for more than a century. And yet, the geological conditions in many parts of Australia are more favourable for underground preservation than for surface preservation. The stable craton geology, the low rates of erosion in the interior, the chemical conditions in some underground environments that favour preservation of organic material, all make underground contexts potentially rich in evidence about the deep past. What is known from underground archaeology in Australia is limited to what has been investigated, which is primarily the known cave systems: Clogs Cave, Cunalda Cave on the Nullarbor, Devil's Lair in Western Australia, a handful of others. These sites have produced remarkable results. Dates extending back 65,000 years at Majedba Bay, complex ceremonial assemblages at Clogs Cave, extraordinary finger flutings, and ochre markings at Cunalda. Each one has revised what archaeologists thought they knew about the depth and character of Australian prehistory. The pattern in these excavations is consistent. Each one, when properly investigated, turns out to contain evidence of human activity that extends further in time and is more complex in character than pre-investigation expectations suggested. The pattern suggests that where underground sites are investigated, they tend to be more archaeologically productive than surface sites in the same region. The geological conditions that create underground spaces, relatively stable, protected from surface weathering, chemically favorable, also tend to create good preservation conditions. This pattern, combined with the traditional knowledge evidence pointing to specific, uninvestigated underground locations, and the historical evidence of colonial-era observers encountering anomalous subsurface features at those same locations, creates a strong prior probability that the uninvestigated sites would be archaeologically significant if they were investigated. Not certainty. A strong prior probability based on what the investigated sites have consistently shown. Strong prior probability is what researchers use to justify investing in investigation. It is the basis on which research programs are proposed and, ideally, funded. The underground country question in the Murray-Darling Basin has the elements of strong prior probability. The gap is not in the evidence base. The gap is in the institutional mechanisms for translating strong prior probability into funded systematic investigation. The mechanism that exists for this purpose in the Australian research system is the ARC linkage grant. The mechanism has been used, unsuccessfully, at least 3 times for variants of this research program. The unsuccessful outcomes are not evidence that the mechanism is incapable of supporting this kind of research. They are evidence that the competition for linkage funding is intense and that interdisciplinary proposals involving Indigenous cultural heritage face specific structural challenges in the assessment process. The structural challenges are known. They have been identified by researchers and by the ARC itself in its periodic reviews of the funding system. The fact that they have been identified does not mean they have been resolved. They persist because resolving them would require changes to the assessment process, the timeline structures, the treatment of community partnership contributions, and the weighting of Indigenous cultural significance in research priority frameworks that have not yet been implemented. These are policy questions as much as scientific ones. They involve decisions about what Australian research institutions believe is worth knowing, and whose knowledge and heritage are treated as meriting the investment of public research funds. The underground country question sits at the intersection of those decisions. In thinking about this question, there is one more piece of evidence that deserves attention. It comes not from a geological survey or a traditional knowledge documentation project or a heritage permit record, but from a remarkable collection of observations made by a single person over an extended period. John Morrison was not an academic. He was a farmer and amateur archaeologist from the Western Victorian Plains who spent decades walking the volcanic landscape and documenting what he found. He was particularly interested in the astronomical alignments of Aboriginal stone arrangements, and his work on the Wurdi Yuang stone arrangement near Little River, which he conducted in collaboration with the local Wathaurong community and with astronomers from the University of Melbourne, contributed significantly to establishing the astronomical significance of that site. But Morisson also documented, in field notes that have been partially digitized and are held at the Ballarat Art Gallery, a series of observations about underground features in the volcanic plains country. He described, over multiple field seasons in the 1980s and 1990s, encountering locations in the lava country where the ground surface showed subtle circular depressions, where the air rising from cracks in the basalt was noticeably cooler in summer than the surrounding air, where striking the ground produced hollow sounds inconsistent with solid basalt, and where the existing lava tube maps showed no feature. He consulted with elders from the Jabwurrung and related communities about these observations. He recorded their responses, which consistently identified the locations he described as known underground places within their traditional knowledge frameworks. He noted the specificity of those identifications. The elders could identify his described locations without visiting them, purely from his descriptions of the surface features, and they provided names and significance designations for the underground features in language. Morisson's field notes are not a scientific document. They are an amateur naturalist's observations, made with genuine care and considerable observational skill, but without the systematic methodology or the instrumental support of a scientific survey. They cannot serve as confirmation of the underground features they describe, but they can serve as an additional thread of evidence, and they provide something that the scientific and archival evidence lacks: a direct account of the correspondence between surface observables and traditional knowledge descriptions, as confirmed in real-time conversation with knowledge holders. The Morisson field notes have not been systematically analyzed in relation to the other evidence threads. They were mentioned in passing in Dr. Schreiber's 2011 research note and have not been pursued further. They sit in the Ballarat Art Gallery archive, accessible to researchers who know they exist, but not integrated into any systematic dataset. They are one more piece of the pattern, one more element of a dataset that has been growing for more than 160 years without triggering the systematic response that its accumulated weight should be producing. The pattern of accumulation and non-response is itself informative. It tells us something about the structure of the knowledge production system that has been operating in Australia since the colonial period, about what that system can and cannot easily incorporate, and about the persistent gap between what the land contains and what the institutional system for understanding the land has been built to see. The gap is not a gap in knowledge, in the sense of information that does not exist. It is a gap in institutional capacity to access and respond to knowledge that does exist, in forms that the institutions were not designed to process. The traditional knowledge of the Barkindji and the Yorta Yorta, and the Dia Dia Wurrung, and the Wemba Wemba, and the Gunai Kurnai is not absent from the world. It is present, maintained, and, in the areas where it has been documented, accessible. The colonial era geological observations are not lost. They are in the Public Record Office. The pastoral station records are not lost. They are in state archives and private family collections. The geophysical survey data from the pilot investigations is not lost. It is in researchers' files. The groundwater anomaly data is not lost. It is in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority monitoring database. Everything needed to understand the question is present somewhere. What has not yet happened is the integration. The bringing together of these scattered pieces into a single coherent research program that submits them all to systematic investigation and produces a result that can be evaluated by the normal criteria of scientific evidence. That integration is what the research program that has been proposed and not funded would produce. It is what the Albury workshop in 2022 was organized to design. It is what the ARC linkage application of 2023 was intended to enable. It is what the next iteration of that application, currently in preparation, is aimed at. The vaults are there, The evidence that they are there has been accumulating since 1863. The knowledge of what they are and what they mean has been maintained by the communities who have known this country for 60,000 years. The research instruments and the research methods needed to investigate them systematically are available and well understood. The collaborative framework needed to do the investigation ethically and productively has been modelled successfully in other Australian research programs. What remains is the sustained institutional commitment to allocate the resources and create the conditions for the investigation to happen. That commitment has not yet been made. The evidence waits for it. The land waits for it. The communities and their knowledge wait for it. Patient in the way that knowledge maintained through 60,000 years of continuous human presence has earned the right to be patient. Not because waiting is comfortable, but because what is being waited for is genuinely worth waiting for. There are questions that stay with researchers long after they have moved on to other projects. The questions that got away, the problems that were put down for reasons of funding or timing or institutional priority and never picked up again, have a way of persisting in the background of a career. They come back at unexpected moments. When reading a paper that touches adjacent territory, when walking in a landscape that resembles the one the question concerns, when a colleague mentions something in passing that reopens the whole puzzle. For Dr. Burke, who was the researcher who produced the most directly physical evidence for the Murray Plain vaults with her ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2004, the Euston survey result has never entirely left her. She described it in a conversation with a colleague, in terms that appear in a published interview in the journal Australian Archaeology in 2018, as one of those results that sit in your files and look at you from across the room. The flat ceiling, she said, referencing the feature that had struck her as most anomalous, is not what natural processes produce. Natural processes produce irregular surfaces. Flat means something made it flat, and I have not been able to find the explanation for what made it flat that does not involve human activity. She had not been funded to investigate further. She had moved on to other projects, but the Euston survey result was still there, in her files, looking at her. For Dr. Hartley, whose archival discovery of the pastoral station records had added 43 anomaly observations to the growing dataset, the question had become personal in a way that purely academic questions often do not. He had grown up in the western New South Wales country. His family had been farming in the Murray-Darling system for 4 generations. The pastoral archives he had been working through were, in some cases, the records of properties that neighbours of his family had operated. Reading those records, he had found himself looking at his own landscape's history from a perspective he had never previously had access to. The Aboriginal workers described in the station records as declining to work near certain bores, as naming certain underground places in language, as knowing things about the subsurface of the country that the managers did not know. These were people who had occupied the same landscape as his family's farm for tens of thousands of years before his family arrived. Their knowledge of that landscape, including the knowledge of what was beneath it, was older and deeper than anything his family had brought. That personal dimension of the research question did not appear in Dr. Hartley's academic writing. Academic writing has conventions that do not accommodate personal revelation easily, but it was present in the way he pursued the question, in the care he brought to the archival work, in the sustained commitment he brought to the collaboration long after retirement. The question mattered to him for reasons that went beyond career or publication record. This is the character of the question for everyone who is engaged with it seriously. It is not an abstract historical puzzle. It is a question about the ground beneath your feet, and the people whose knowledge of that ground extends thousands of times further back than your own. If you are Australian, it is a question about the country you call home and the history of that country that the institutions you were educated in have not yet fully equipped you to understand. The underground country of the Murray-Darling Basin, whatever it turns out to be, is part of that history. The knowledge of it, held in traditional knowledge systems and scattered through colonial archives and partially confirmed by pilot geophysical surveys, is part of the heritage that all Australians, in some sense, inhabit. Not in the sense that all Australians have the same relationship to it as the communities whose ancestors created and maintained it. They do not. And it is important not to flatten that distinction, but in the sense that the land they live on has a history that extends far beyond what they have been taught, and that history is not inaccessible. It is present, maintained, waiting. The historians who cannot explain the vaults beneath Australia are not historians who have been defeated by insufficient evidence. They are historians who have been defeated, so far, by insufficient integration of the evidence that exists. The gap is not in the evidence. It is in the institutional capacity to bring the evidence together, submit it to systematic investigation, and allow the results to expand our understanding of who was here and what they did and how long ago and why it matters now. That gap can be closed. The research that would close it has been designed and proposed and reviewed and ranked. What it needs is the sustained commitment of the institutions that have the resources and the responsibility to provide it. When that commitment is made and the investigation proceeds and the results come in, the vaults beneath Australia will not be mysterious in the same way. They will be understood, at least partially, in the terms that the communities who have always known them have maintained throughout, as features of a landscape that has been inhabited, engaged with, and cared for by human beings for longer than most of the world's civilizations have existed, as part of the deep history of a continent whose human story is older, more complex, and more extraordinary than the standard account has yet been willing to fully represent. That story is worth knowing. The evidence that there is more of it to discover is substantial. The knowledge that can guide the discovery is alive and present in the communities whose ancestors created it. The instruments to do the investigation exist. The methods are established. The collaborative framework has been demonstrated to work in analogous contexts. What remains is the decision to proceed. Go back to the river one final time. Not in 1863. Now. The Murray is running tonight, as it runs every night, carrying water from the snowfields of the Australian Alps through 2,000 miles of river country before it meets the Southern Ocean at Goolwa. Its flow tonight is less than it was a century ago, before the dams and the extraction and the irrigation schemes remade the hydrology of the basin. The red gums along its banks are less numerous than they were before the millennial drought. The pelicans and the ibis and the royal spoonbill are fewer than they were in the accounts of the first European explorers. The river is stressed, as all large river systems in the world are stressed by the demands of the civilizations that have built themselves around them. Beneath the river, at the specific locations that have been described in traditional knowledge and documented in colonial archives, and partly confirmed by geophysical survey, the underground country continues in whatever state it has been in for whatever length of time it has occupied. The geological processes that maintain it are very slow. A century and a half of non-investigation has not changed it materially. The features that Denby's probe rod encountered in 1863 are, in all likelihood, much the same features they were then. The knowledge that describes these features is also much the same as it was then, though the people who hold it have changed many times over, and the conditions under which the knowledge has been maintained have been transformed, mostly by forces of disruption and diminishment, in ways that have made the maintenance harder. The knowledge has survived those transformations. It has not survived them untouched or without cost, but it has survived them. What has changed since 1863? Besides the population of the basin and the volume of water in the river and the number of red gums on the banks, is the capacity of scientific instruments to investigate the underground features. The ground-penetrating radar that Dr. Bork used in 2004 did not exist in 1863. The passive seismic monitoring that would be used in the systematic survey that has been proposed and not funded did not exist in 1863. The groundwater monitoring network that produced the correlated pressure anomaly that Dr. Morrow identified in 2021 did not exist in 1863. What also has changed is the legal and ethical framework within which research involving Aboriginal cultural heritage takes place. The Native Title Act of 1993, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act, the AIATSIS Code of Ethics, none of these existed in 1863. The rights and interests of traditional owner communities in their cultural heritage and the mechanisms for asserting and protecting those rights have been established and strengthened in the past 30 years in ways that make genuinely collaborative research not only ethically required, but legally supported. The conditions for the investigation to happen are better now than they have ever been. The evidence base is stronger than it has ever been. The collaborative frameworks are more developed than they have ever been. The technical capacity is greater than it has ever been. The question of why the investigation has not happened is not, at this point, a question about capacity, or about evidence, or about legal or ethical frameworks. It is a question about priority, about what the institutions that control research funding have decided, through their allocation decisions, matters enough to invest in. Priority decisions change. They change when new evidence accumulates. They change when new people enter decision-making roles with different views about what matters. They change when communities assert their interests in forms that the institutions find impossible to ignore. They change when researchers find new ways to make the case for the importance of their questions. They change when the public understanding of what Australian history means and what it contains shifts far enough to create pressure for a different kind of investment. Any of these changes could tip the balance for the underground country research program. The arc linkage application that is in preparation, drawing on the Albury workshop of 2022 and the decade of evidence accumulation that preceded it, will submit the case again. The traditional owner communities who are partners in that application will assert their interest in their heritage with the authority of communities that have been maintaining that heritage for 60,000 years. The researchers who have been working on this question from different angles and through different careers will bring their accumulated evidence to bear as effectively as they can. Whether it is enough this time or the time after is not knowable from here. What is knowable is that the evidence is there, and the knowledge is there, and the need is there, and the capacity to meet it is there. The only thing that is not there yet is the sustained institutional commitment to bring them together. That commitment is what the 12 priority locations are waiting for. That commitment is what the Barkinji and the Yorta Yorta and the Dia Dia Wurrung and the Wemba Wemba are waiting for. That commitment is what Edward Horatio Denby's field notebook, sitting in the Public Record Office, Victoria under reference VPRS 625, has been waiting for since September the 14th, 1863. The river keeps running. The country keeps waiting. There is one more thing to say about this story, and it is perhaps the most important thing, though it is the hardest to say without sounding either sentimental or grandiose. The story of the vaults beneath Australia is a story about knowledge and time, about what it means for knowledge to persist across timescales that dwarf the lifespan of any single person or any single institution or any single civilization, about what it means for a community to commit itself to maintaining knowledge that might not be confirmed or even acknowledged in their lifetimes, or in the lifetimes of their children, or in the lifetimes of many generations of their children. The Barkinji elders who sat with the UNSW researchers in the 1990s and described the underground country of the Murray Plain were not doing so because they expected an immediate result. They were doing so because the knowledge had been placed in their care and it was their responsibility to see it through, to keep it alive until the moment when the conditions existed for it to be fully recognized and properly investigated. That is a different relationship to knowledge than the one that governs academic research. Academic research is organized around the production of new knowledge within defined timeframes, evaluated by criteria of novelty and significance that are calibrated to human career scales and institutional budget cycles. The knowledge that has been maintained in the traditional knowledge systems of the Murray-Darling Basin communities is organized around a completely different set of criteria. Completeness over accuracy at any single point, continuity over novelty, obligation over career interest. These two relationships to knowledge are not incompatible. They are not even in tension when the institutions that govern academic research are designed to accommodate both. The challenge in the Australian case is that the institutions were not designed with traditional knowledge systems in mind. They were designed in a context where the knowledge forms that counted were written and published and peer-reviewed, and where Indigenous knowledge was treated as data for academic research rather than as a co-equal form of knowing that deserved engagement on its own terms. That design is changing. The changes are slow, uneven, and incomplete, but they are real. The AI ATSIS Code of Ethics, the Murrup Burrup Indigenous research frameworks at major universities, the mandatory cultural safety training now required in many research contexts, the growing number of Indigenous researchers, and Indigenous-led research programs. These are genuine changes in the institutional landscape. They create conditions in which research of the kind the underground country question requires is more possible than it was 20 years ago. What they have not yet produced is then the specific research program that would address the underground country question systematically. That program remains to be designed, funded, and executed. But the conditions for it are more favorable now than they have ever been. The mystery that the title of this story announces is a real mystery, in the sense that the features it describes are real and their full character and meaning have not yet been established. But it is a mystery of a specific kind, not a mystery of vanished evidence or deliberate concealment, but a mystery of unexecuted research. A mystery that the existing evidence and the existing methods and the existing collaborative frameworks are sufficient to address if the institutional commitment to address it is made. That commitment, when it comes, will not resolve all the questions that the underground country raises. It will resolve the most basic one, the question of whether the convergent evidence from traditional knowledge and colonial archives and pilot geophysical surveys corresponds to real features of the real landscape. It will open a new set of questions about the character and meaning and age of those features, questions that will require their own sustained programs of investigation. Australian archaeology has a tradition of exactly this kind of progress. The investigation of Majid Bibi pushed back the date of Australian occupation dramatically and opened new questions about the character of the earliest occupation. The investigation of Bumaj Bim revealed a technology and management system of world significance that nobody outside the Gunditjmara community had previously appreciated. The Sea Country program is revealing the extent and character of human occupation of landscapes now submerged under the sea, transforming the understanding of coastal prehistory. Each of these programs followed the same pattern. Evidence accumulated, proposals were developed, funding was eventually secured, investigation proceeded, and results emerged that expanded the field's understanding in ways that had not been fully predictable in advance. The Underground Country program is next in this sequence, not because the researchers working on it have been more patient or more persistent than their predecessors in the other programs, but because the evidence has reached the point where the case for investigation is as strong as the cases for those other programs were at the moments they received their decisive institutional support. That decisive moment has not yet arrived for the Underground Country program. When it does, the landscape will have something to show for all the waiting. The vaults will have their investigation. The traditional knowledge will have its systematic confirmation or its systematic disconfirmation, either of which is a more respectful outcome than continued systematic non-investigation. The questions will begin to find answers. Until then, the river runs, and the ground holds its features in geological patience, and the knowledge continues its patient work of being maintained, generation by generation, in the oldest continuous knowledge tradition on Earth. There is something in that patience that is worth trying to understand. Something that the institutions that have not yet found the way to investigate this question might benefit from considering, not as a romantic sentiment, but as a practical observation. The communities that have maintained this knowledge through conditions of extreme disruption did so because they understood that knowledge is not abstract, it is grounded, it is specific. It refers to real places and real features and real relationships between people and country that persist across time in ways that short-cycle institutional processes are not designed to track. 60,000 years is a very long time to maintain a knowledge tradition. The communities that have done it are not simply repositories. They are practitioners, people in active relationship with the knowledge and with the country that the knowledge describes. That active relationship is what has kept the knowledge alive, and it is also what makes the knowledge useful for the investigation that has not yet happened. When the investigation finally happens, it will not be archaeologists descending on an uninhabited landscape to extract data. It will be researchers and knowledge holders working together in a landscape that is still inhabited by the people who have always inhabited it, with their accumulated knowledge and their living relationship with their country as the central resource of the research. That is how this story ends, when it ends. Not with a discovery that overturns everything and answers all the questions, but with a conversation, long overdue and finally begun, between the knowledge that the land has held in human memory for 60,000 years and the instruments that the last 2 centuries have produced for examining what the land contains. That conversation is the discovery. Consider for a moment the full scope of what 60,000 years of continuous occupation means for the question of underground knowledge. The first anatomically modern humans arrived in Australia around 65,000 years ago, crossing from what is now Indonesia across a chain of islands and open water channels that no longer look the same as they did then, because sea levels have risen by more than 100 meters since the last ice age. Those first arrivals were not wandering in an unfamiliar landscape. They were people adapted to the landscapes of Southeast Asia and the island chains between, people with sophisticated knowledge of their environments and with the cognitive capacity to build new knowledge in new places. Within a few thousand years of their arrival, these people had spread across the continent. The evidence for this spread is in the dated archaeological sites that exist from every major region of Australia. Majid Bebe in the Northern Territory, Devil's Lair in Western Australia, Lake Mungo in New South Wales, Warring Cave in Tasmania, all dating to 50,000 years ago or older. The spread happened faster than would be possible without sophisticated knowledge of how to live in unfamiliar environments. Faster than would be possible without communication between groups, faster than would be possible without the cognitive toolkit that produces things like planning and coordination and the transmission of knowledge across generations. From that beginning, the knowledge systems of Australian Aboriginal peoples had 65,000 years to develop, to observe every aspect of every landscape they inhabited, to test observations against outcomes, to refine understanding through generations of feedback, to encode knowledge in forms that could be transmitted reliably across the enormous time spans involved, to build up the extraordinary depth and precision of ecological, geographical, and geological knowledge that their descendants carry today. The knowledge of underground country, in this context, is not something that developed late or that represents a special category of knowledge. It is part of the general framework of landscape knowledge that developed over the full span of Australian occupation. People who lived in intimate daily contact with a landscape noticed its underground character the same way they noticed everything else about it. Through observation, through experience, through the testing of what was known against what was real. When a Barkindji elder in the 1990s described the underground country of the Murray Plain in terms that corresponded to features detectable by geophysical survey, that correspondence did not emerge from a tradition of mystical intuition. It emerged from a tradition of careful observation and reliable transmission that had been running, with appropriate modifications at each stage, for a very long time. The accuracy of the correspondence is a demonstration of how good a knowledge tradition can be when it is maintained with genuine care over sufficient time. The institutional failure to investigate that knowledge is, in this light, not just a failure of research priority. It is a failure to take seriously what 65,000 years of systematic observation can produce. It is a failure of epistemic humility, of the willingness to recognize that forms of knowing different from the ones you were trained in can be more accurate and more detailed than the ones you were trained in their domains of application. The researchers who have worked on this question have not, for the most part, made this argument explicitly. They have framed their proposals in the language of interdisciplinary research and methodological innovation and collaborative frameworks. These framings are all accurate and all appropriate for the institutional contexts in which the proposals were submitted. But the underlying argument, the one that the evidence supports most strongly, is simpler and more direct than any of these framings suggests. The knowledge is there. It is accurate. It should be investigated. The failure to investigate it is a failure that has costs. Those costs include the research knowledge that is not being produced. But they include something more than that. They include the signal that is being sent to communities that have maintained their knowledge through conditions designed to destroy it, through epidemic disease and forced removal and family separation and boarding schools and the systematic denial of the validity of their ways of knowing. The signal that their knowledge still does not merit the investment that would confirm it is not a benign signal. It is one more repetition of the message that has been sent to those communities for 200 years. The decision to fund the research would send a different message. Not a message of charity or condescension, but a message of recognition. Recognition that the knowledge is real and significant and deserves the resources needed to understand it fully. That is not a grandiose claim. It is a factual one. The knowledge is real. The evidence that it corresponds to real features of the landscape is substantial. The resources needed to understand it fully are available. The decision to allocate them remains to be made. When it is made, the conversation will begin. And the conversation, as we have said, is the discovery. The night sky over the Murray Plain is extraordinary when you are away from the lights of the towns. The Milky Way stretches overhead with a clarity that is increasingly rare in the lit-up world that most people inhabit. The river sounds different at night, quieter and somehow more itself. The constant small sounds of its current and its banks and its reeds resolving without the day's background noise into something close to music. The Barkindji have been watching this sky for 60,000 years. They have names for the constellations that include dark constellations, shapes made by the dark patches in the Milky Way rather than by the stars themselves, an approach to the night sky that treats darkness as positive space rather than background. The Emu in the sky, one of the most famous dark constellations, is visible from this river in the right season at the right angle. The knowledge of when to see it and what it means in terms of the emu's terrestrial behavior, when the emus are nesting and when the eggs are available, is part of the larger system of ecological knowledge that includes knowledge of what is below the river plain as well as what is above it. This is the character of knowledge, accumulated over 60,000 years in a landscape. It is comprehensive. It does not separate the sky from the earth, or the surface from what is beneath it. It holds the whole landscape as an integrated system of relationships and knowledge, in which what happens above the ground and what happens below the ground are both part of the same story. The researchers who are trying to understand the underground country of the Murray-Darling Basin are working within a knowledge tradition that separates its domains. Geology is one discipline. Archaeology is another. Hydrology is a third. Anthropology, the study of human knowledge traditions, is a fourth. The underground country question sits across all four, which is exactly why it has been so difficult to address within the disciplinary structure of modern research institutions. The traditional knowledge system that holds the most specific information about the underground country does not observe these disciplinary boundaries. It holds the underground features, the emu in the sky, the seasonal behavior of the emus on the ground, the location of the water sources, the character of the soil and the behavior of the floods and the timing of the fish runs all as parts of a single integrated account of a living landscape. This is not a limitation of the knowledge system. It is one of its strengths. The integration is what makes the knowledge useful, what makes it possible to know things about the underground country that purely geological or purely hydrological investigation would not reveal. The challenge for the research program that is trying to bridge the two knowledge systems is not primarily a technical challenge. The geophysical instruments exist. The archival sources are accessible. The statistical methods are available. The challenge is one of design. How to create a research framework that allows both knowledge systems to contribute their specific strengths to the common question in a way that produces results that are credible and useful to both communities of knowledge holders. This design challenge is not unique to the Australian underground country question. It is the central challenge of any genuinely interdisciplinary research that takes Indigenous knowledge seriously as a co-equal contributor rather than as a source of interesting local colour. It has been addressed, with varying degrees of success, in the Sea Country program and the Budge Bim research and the Majid Bebe excavation and a handful of other exemplary projects. The lessons from those projects are available and applicable. What the Underground Country program needs to add to the existing models is a specific methodology for the interface between traditional knowledge of underground features and geophysical survey of those features. The Albury Workshop of 2022 began developing that methodology. The research proposals that have come from that workshop and the conversations with the traditional owner communities that are ongoing are advancing it further. The methodology that is emerging is essentially this. The traditional knowledge holders describe the character of specific locations in their own terms, using the framework of their knowledge tradition. The researchers translate those descriptions into geophysical hypotheses. What specific kinds of physical features would be present if the traditional knowledge description is accurate? The geophysical survey then tests those hypotheses at the specified locations. The results are interpreted in dialogue between the geophysical data and the traditional knowledge framework, with each informing the reading of the other. This methodology is not simple. It requires sustained relationship and genuine mutual understanding between the research partners. It requires the kind of trust that takes time to build and can be damaged easily by institutional insensitivity. It requires flexibility in the research design to accommodate the constraints and priorities of all the partners. And it requires the recognition that the results, whatever they are, belong to all the partners equally, not primarily to the academic researchers who design the instruments and write the papers. When those conditions are met, the methodology can produce research of the highest quality. The Budge Bim research demonstrated this. The Sea Country research has demonstrated this. The underground country research can demonstrate it too, when the conditions are met. The conditions are closer to being met than they have ever been. The traditional owner communities have institutional capacity through their land councils and native title bodies and cultural heritage organizations that they did not have when the first documentation projects were conducted in the 1990s. The research institutions have frameworks for genuine partnership that they did not have in the early 2000s when the first geophysical surveys were conducted. The funding mechanisms for interdisciplinary research involving Indigenous knowledge holders have been refined, though they have not yet produced the outcome that this specific research program needs. The closeness to the conditions being met does not guarantee that the next application will succeed or that the research will happen in any particular time frame. But it means that the conversation about how to make it happen is being conducted by people who understand what it would take and who have the relationships and the institutional connections to make it happen if the resources can be secured. That is where the story is now. Not at the beginning, not at the end. Somewhere in the middle of a very long process, longer than any single research career, longer than the lifespan of any institution that has been involved in it, though shorter by a very great deal than the 60,000 years of knowledge maintenance that makes the question worth asking in the first place. The vaults are waiting. The knowledge of them is waiting. The instruments that could investigate them are waiting. The researchers who understand the question are in conversation with the communities who hold the knowledge and working on the proposals that could secure the resources. What comes next is not yet written, but the next chapter, whenever it arrives, will be built on everything that has accumulated in the chapters before it. The 1863 Field Notebook, the 1877 Geological Survey, the 1990s, Traditional Knowledge Documentation, the 2004 Geophysical Surveys, the 2009 Archival Synthesis, the 2022 Workshop, and all the pieces in between. None of it has been wasted. Evidence does not waste. It waits in the way that the underground country itself waits, patient, specific, grounded in the landscape it describes, holding its character against the weight of everything above it, available to be known when the knowing is finally attempted. Think for a moment about the Tulibuck slump, the riverbank that gave way in 1863 and exposed what Denby's probe rod encountered. That exposure was temporary. Riverbanks slump and then revegetate, and then slump again in the ordinary rhythm of the river's edge. The face that Denby examined in September of 1863 is long since gone, covered by new growth or by subsequent slumpage or by both. The underlying feature, at 4 meters below the original surface level, is still there. The river continues to undercut and expose and recover the faces of its banks in a cycle that is much older than any of the human activity associated with this story. This image of the river's patient geological work, exposing and covering and exposing again what is beneath, is a useful metaphor for the research history. The evidence keeps coming to the surface. It appears in geological survey reports and pastoral records and traditional knowledge documentation projects and groundwater monitoring data. It appears, is noted, and then is covered again by the ordinary business of the institutions that produce it. The next project, the next report, the next funding cycle. What is beneath does not change. The exposure keeps happening. The systematic response keeps not happening. The metaphor has a limit though. Riverbank exposures are driven by geological processes that do not respond to human decisions. The research program that would systematically investigate the underground country is driven by human decisions. The decisions of funding bodies, of research institutions, of traditional owner communities, of individual researchers. Those decisions can change in ways that geological processes cannot. And the decisions that matter are not only the large institutional ones, the ARC funding decision, the university research priority decision, the government heritage policy decision. They are also the smaller decisions that create the conditions for the large ones. The decision of a researcher to persist with a question after it has failed to attract funding. The decision of a community organization to continue engaging with research partnerships that have not yet produced tangible results. The decision of an archival institution to make its holdings more accessible to researchers working on questions like this one. The decision of a journal to publish research notes that do not resolve questions, but that document the evidence for those questions. Each of these smaller decisions has been made, repeatedly, by the people who have kept this question alive through its long period of non-investigation. Without those decisions, the data set would not exist. The archival evidence would not be assembled. The geophysical pilot data would not be in anyone's files. The collaborative relationships between researchers and communities would not have been built. The larger decision, the one that funds the systematic investigation, is the decision that the smaller decisions have been creating the conditions for. It has not yet been made. But the conditions for it are more substantial now than they have ever been, precisely because of the accumulated effect of all the smaller decisions that have been made over more than 160 years. This is what it means for evidence to wait. Not passive waiting, not patient resignation, but the active work of maintaining and building and slowly creating the conditions for the moment when the decisive step can be taken. The evidence does not wait like a stone waits, inert and unchanging. It waits like knowledge waits, actively held, continuously maintained, gradually assembled into the form that will eventually make its investigation irresistible. The vaults beneath Australia are part of this active waiting. They are real features of a real landscape, held in real knowledge systems, documented in real archival records, and partially confirmed by real scientific instruments. They have been waiting for the systematic investigation that their evidence base demands, and the conditions for that investigation have been slowly assembling around them for more than a century and a half. The night sky over the Murray is dark enough out here that you can see the dark constellations as well as the bright ones. The emu stretches across the sky from one horizon toward the other, its head in the Southern Cross, its body following the dark rifts in the Milky Way. The Barkindji knew it. They have known it for 60,000 years. Below the plain, the features that Cartwright's probe rod encountered in 1877, the same features that old Billy described as the hidden rooms of the Wemba Wemba, whatever they are, and however they came to be there, hold their character against the weight of the alluvial plain above them. They are not going anywhere. The investigation that would tell us what they are is not here yet, but it is being built toward, piece by piece, decision by decision, archive visit by archive visit, community meeting by community meeting, instrument deployment by instrument deployment. The conditions are forming, the knowledge is maintained, the evidence accumulates. One day, which may not be far now, someone will sink a probe rod into the right place in the right configuration with the right instruments and the right partnerships and ask the question that has been building since September the 14th, 1863, and the ground beneath the Murray Plain will finally answer. What it says when it answers is the part of this story that has not yet been written. Sleep comes differently in country like this. In the flat river country of the Murray Plain, away from the lights and the sounds of the towns, the dark is complete and the quiet is a presence rather than an absence. The river makes its sounds, but they are river sounds, old sounds, sounds that have been part of this country for longer than anything else about it. The frogs along the banks, the occasional night bird, the wind through the river red gums with their pale trunks that glow slightly in the dark, the stars above, the emu overhead, the Southern Cross tilted toward the south. People have been falling asleep in this country, under this sky, beside this river, for 60,000 years. The landscape has held them through all of that time, the ancestors of the Barkindji and their ancestors before them, and the ancestors of those ancestors stretching back through the full span of human occupation of this continent. All of them sleeping under the same stars, beside the same river, on the same earth, above the same underground country that the instruments have not yet reached. There is something about this kind of continuity that is worth resting in for a moment, before the conversation ends and the ordinary world reasserts itself. The continuity of a landscape inhabited long enough that the knowledge of it has become part of the landscape itself. The underground features encoded in the memory of communities whose ancestors knew them. The surface features encoded in the names of places that have not changed through tens of thousands of years of language evolution and cultural adaptation. The sky encoded in stories about dark constellations that track the seasons and tell the people what the animals are doing below. This is what 60,000 years of continuous occupation produces. A landscape that is also a library, a memory, a map. Not a museum, not a fossil record, but a living system of knowledge in active relationship with a living landscape. The vaults beneath Australia, whatever they are part of that library. They are part of the memory that the communities have maintained through everything that has been done to interrupt and destroy that maintenance. They are part of the map that those communities carry of a landscape that extends, in their knowledge, all the way down to features that geophysical instruments are only beginning to be able to detect. That knowledge and that landscape, and the people who are the living link between them, deserve the investigation that the evidence calls for. They have deserved it for more than 160 years. The investigation has been designed and proposed and reviewed. What it needs is the moment when the conditions align completely and the decision is made and the work begins. Until that moment, the river runs and the ground holds and the stars turn overhead in the patterns that people have been watching since before any civilization in the rest of the world had thought to look. The knowledge is there. The land is there. The people who hold the knowledge and live on the land are there. The rest is a question of when, not whether. And the knowledge will be waiting, patient and specific and grounded in the oldest, continuously inhabited landscape on Earth for as long as it takes. There is a final thread in this story that deserves its own space. It is the thread of what happens to the researchers themselves when they spend years working on a question that is not resolved, that keeps generating evidence without producing the investigation the evidence calls for, that keeps being proposed and not funded, that keeps drawing them back, despite the absence of the institutional reward that academic careers normally require. What happens to them is something that most academic research does not produce. It produces a kind of relationship with the question that goes beyond professional interest into something more personal, more committed, more difficult to walk away from. Dr. Burke, when asked in that 2018 Australian archaeology interview about why she had stayed engaged with the underground country question through 3 unsuccessful funding applications and the demands of a full academic career doing other research, gave an answer that the interviewer noted as unusual for its directness. She said that she had looked at a result that she could not explain with reference to natural processes, and that she had an obligation to try to understand it, not a professional obligation. A deeper one, though she found it difficult to specify exactly what that obligation was or where it came from. She said something else that is worth quoting at length, because it gets at something that the purely analytical account of this story does not fully capture. She said, "The communities whose knowledge corresponds to what I found in that survey have been maintaining that correspondence, keeping that knowledge alive through 200 years of conditions that were designed to destroy it. The colonial system tried very hard to erase what they knew. It did not succeed. They still know what is beneath their country. And the least I can do, given that they are still here and still holding that knowledge, is to keep trying to find a way to confirm it in the terms that the institutions I work for understand. This is the dimension of the story that numbers and map coordinates and funding application ratings cannot fully convey. The traditional owner communities, whose knowledge has persisted through epidemics and dispossession and forced removal and boarding schools, and the systematic denial of their humanity, are not abstract historical subjects. They are people, living in their country today, maintaining knowledge that their ancestors judged worth maintaining through every kind of adversity. That persistence is not merely admirable, it is a form of evidence. It tells you something about the quality of the knowledge that has been maintained. Knowledge worth that much effort to preserve is knowledge that someone judged, across many generations, to be genuinely accurate and genuinely important. Dr. Hartley, the historian who retired without seeing his pastoral records analysis generate the research program it was designed to support, kept the photocopies of the station records in a file in his study after retirement. He continued on an informal basis to look for new archival materials that might add to the dataset. He found, in the records of a private pastoral family that had donated materials to the State Library of New South Wales in the early 2000s, 2 additional Boer records from the Tulibuk district from the 1890s, both describing anomalous subsurface conditions at depths and locations consistent with the core Kundruk dataset. He brought these to the attention of the 2022 Albury workshop by letter, unable to attend in person due to health. His letter, read at the workshop, added these 2 observations to the dataset that the arc linkage application was based on. That is what continued commitment to an unresolved question looks like in practice, not dramatic persistence in the face of opposition. The quiet work of continuing to look, to notice, to document, to pass the material forward to the people who will build the next proposal. Dr. Fitzallen, whose hydrological cross-reference work from 1998 was one of the foundation pieces of the dataset, moved on to work on water quality and groundwater salinity management in the Murray-Darling system in the 2000s. Her work on those questions was significant and has been influential in the basin management framework. But she retained her connection to the traditional knowledge holders she had worked with in the UNSW project. And when the 2022 Albury workshop was being organized, she was one of the people contacted to provide background on the early groundwater anomaly work. She provided her original analysis files which had not been digitized and which contain monitoring data that predates the current Murray-Darling Basin Authority monitoring network. Those files are now part of the research archive that the 2023 ARC application drew on. The story of the researchers who have worked on this question, alongside the story of the communities whose knowledge they have been trying to understand and confirm, is a story about what it means to take a question seriously over a long time, under difficult conditions. It is not a heroic story in any simple sense. Most of the work is archival and methodological and proposal writing and relationship building, unglamorous activities without which the science cannot happen. The glamour, if it comes later, when the investigation finally produces the results that the decades of preparation make possible. But the unglamorous preparation is the real story of how science happens when the questions are hard and the evidence is scattered and the institutional conditions are unfavorable. It happens because specific people in specific institutions with specific connections to specific communities decide that the question matters enough to keep working on, even when the work is slow and the rewards are few and the outcome is uncertain. Those people are still working on the underground country question. The question has not been abandoned, the evidence continues to accumulate, the communities continue to maintain their knowledge. The researchers continue to build the proposals and the relationships and the methodological frameworks that will make the investigation possible when the resources are secured. The vaults beneath Australia have been waiting for more than 160 years for the systematic investigation their evidence demands. They will, in all probability, not have to wait indefinitely. The conditions are assembling. The knowledge is maintained. The instruments are ready. When the moment comes, and the investigation proceeds, and the results emerge from the underground country that has been described in knowledge and noted in archives and partially confirmed by instruments and waiting for the full accounting that only systematic research can provide, the story that has been building since September the 14th, 1863 will reach the chapter that everything before it has been building toward. That chapter will be written by researchers and community members working together in the river country that has been inhabited for 60,000 years, with the instruments of modern science and the knowledge of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, asking the question that the evidence has been asking on their behalf since a colonial surveyor probed a slumped riverbank and felt his rod give slightly against something that the ground should not have contained. The question is simple. It has always been simple. What is down there? The answer is close, not certain, not yet arrived, but closer than it has ever been. The river will be running when the answer comes. The stars will be the same stars that have been above this country since the first people arrived and looked up and began the long work of understanding where they had come to and what it contained. The emu will be in the sky in its dark constellation form. Its presence made of absence, its shape defined by what is not there rather than what is, a different way of seeing the same sky that has something to teach about what is always present even when it is not immediately visible. The knowledge is present, the evidence is present, the land is present. The investigation is next. And perhaps that is the note to end on. Not with resolution, but with the texture of what it actually feels like to be in the middle of a story this large and this slow. To be somewhere in the middle reaches of a question that began before living memory and has not yet arrived at its conclusion. To hold the accumulation of evidence in mind, all the threads gathered and compared, and to feel not frustration, but something closer to wonder at how consistent it has all been, how persistently the pieces have pointed in the same direction without anyone directing them to do so. The geological surveys were done for economic reasons. The pastoral bore records were kept for practical ones. The traditional knowledge was maintained for reasons that go deeper than either. Reasons rooted in the understanding that knowledge is connection, that knowing what is beneath the country you inhabit is part of what it means to belong to it. The geophysical pilot surveys were done because a researcher looked at a cross-reference and followed it to its logical next step. The archival work was done because a historian noticed a category of observation that did not fit the framework he was using and was curious enough to pursue it. None of these people, except perhaps the traditional knowledge holders who understood from the beginning what the knowledge was pointing toward, knew that they were contributing to the same question. They were each doing their own work, following their own professional paths, encountering the underground country evidence in the context of other research programs and noting it in the ways available to them. The connection between their contributions emerged only when someone compared them, when the researchers came together at the Albury workshop and saw for the first time that 4 decades of work by independent researchers had been converging on the same answer. That moment, the moment when scattered evidence resolves into a coherent picture, is one of the most satisfying moments in research. It is the moment when the shape of the question becomes clear, even if the answer to it is not yet available. The shape of the underground country question is now clear, in a way that it was not before the Albury workshop. The evidence base is assembled. The methodology is designed. The partnerships are in place. The question is well formed. The answer is next. In the country along the Murray, where the red gums grow and the river runs, and the stars are visible in their ancient patterns on nights when the sky is clear, the knowledge of the underground country continues to be held by the people who have always held it. Their great-grandchildren are growing up knowing that their country has depths that the maps don't show, and that the investigation that would confirm those depths is being built toward. They will grow up knowing both what their elders have always known and what the researchers have been assembling as evidence. When the investigation happens, those children, or their children, will be the generation that stands in the river country, watching the instruments confirm what the knowledge has always said. That moment, whenever it comes, will not be a discovery in the colonial sense of a discovery. It will be a recognition. The knowledge was always there. The evidence was always accumulating. The features were always in the ground. The recognition will be the moment when the two forms of knowing, the knowledge held in 60,000 years of continuous tradition and the knowledge assembled in the instruments of modern geophysical science, finally arrive at the same place at the same time and confirm each other. That is what is waiting beneath the Murray Plain. Not treasure, not a lost civilization in the sensational sense. Something more interesting and more important than either of those things, the physical confirmation of the oldest knowledge tradition on Earth, in the landscape that tradition has always described. The country knows what it holds. The people know what the country holds. The instruments can find it. The investigation is coming. Sleep well wherever you are listening from. The river is running. The stars are turning. The knowledge is maintained. The ground will answer when the question is properly asked. There is a thing that happens when you spend a long time with a question of this kind. When you have read enough of the evidence and held it in mind long enough and thought carefully enough about what it means and what it implies, you begin to have a relationship with the question that is different in quality from the relationship you have with questions that are simpler and faster to resolve. The underground country question has that quality. It is a question that has been generating evidence for more than 160 years without resolution. Holding it in mind, in all its complexity and patience, produces a kind of clarity about what really matters in the work of trying to understand the past. What matters is not the speed of the resolution. What matters is the accuracy and the respect and the sustained commitment with which the question is pursued. The communities who have maintained the knowledge of the underground country through everything that was done to destroy that maintenance did not do it for speed. They did it for accuracy and for respect for what the knowledge represents, and for the sustained commitment that knowledge transmission over 60,000 years requires. Those qualities, accuracy and respect and sustained commitment, are also what the best research looks like. When the research that brings the instruments and the knowledge together finally happens, it will need to embody those qualities. It will need to be as patient as the knowledge has been, as precise as the knowledge has been, as committed to the truth of what is there, whatever that truth turns out to be, as the communities who have been holding the knowledge in trust for the generation that finally gets to ask the question with the full weight of evidence and the full complement of instruments and the full depth of partnership that the question has always deserved. That generation is not far off. The preparation is nearly complete. The ground is ready to answer. The answer, when it comes, will belong to all of them, to the elders, to the surveyors, to the researchers, to the river, still running above it all, ancient and present all along.